What's up, Internet? We are back with another awesome bit of my gaming collection. Jazz hands. And you know, some people have asked me, Fury, do you have Game Boy games? Well, one or two, 100. I think I've got about 200 in this container. And I gotta say, I think this video is a little bit cursed. Because when I started making these collection videos, I was actually moving rooms, and this was the very first video I wanted to do because not only do I think I've got some interesting games in here, because the Game Boy has a pretty interesting library. I have them all in one place, and when you're moving rooms and all your games are in like 4 different places, when people tell you to do your PS2 collection, that will be a 3-hour-long video that you have to spend days collecting all your games from different locations to make that work. Yeah, it's a little bit difficult. But I kept pushing that we do Game Boy because I think Game Boy was a good one, but they kept wanting other stuff, and you know, they help support the show so you get on there, maybe you can get a vote. So when there was basically a deadlock, I decided, alright, screw it, we're doing Game Boy. We are doing my entire Game Boy family, mainly because I keep my Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance stuff all together, all at once. And to be fair, there are those like weird Game Boy Color games that work on the Game Boy, and I'm not sure if they're one or the other. I have no idea how to classify them at all. Like, even to this day, I'm not sure if they're Game Boy Color or Game Boy Classic. They work on both, but, you know, whatever. So we're going to take a look at this. It's not going to be in the same order as normal, where I'd like to do stuff alphabetically, because of course I've got them all crammed in this box, so we're just going to pull stuff out and see what happens. But of course, before we do that, a little bit of history of the console, because, you know, as with everything, there's a story, and it's worth going into. So, the original Game Boy was kind of my very first video game device that was entirely mine. Before that, I had a Sega Master System, but that was something that my parents bought so that my cousins would be entertained when they came to visit just after I was born, and they never played it. And I love that SMS, and my parents gave it away to a pawn shop for free when I was in high school, and I'm still angry about that to this day. And my family's feelings about video games are very similar in this story about Game Boy. See, my dad worked in construction, and when I was, I want to say 3 or 4, I went with him and my mom to a company picnic. And my dad happened to win a door prize. He won second prize. And second prize happened to be a Game Boy, as well as 2 games and a poster. And I loved that poster. That poster was amazing. I probably looked at it for many, many hours because it was a game that intrigued me, and I never had a chance to play it. Always wanted to. But unfortunately my parents threw it away. But thanks to the power of nostalgia, I can actually show it to you. Come on. See, if we go all the way over to my game collection, up here, past my yellow guys, my Digimon collection, Death Scythe riding Alduin over there, and of course, my amiibos, we have my jank-ass light switch. But also, we have a poster for Metroid 2 Return of Samus, which is ridiculously out of focus. There we go. And I love this poster. I wanted it so bad after my parents threw it out, and honestly, I never got it back. It was a game I never got to play, but I bought myself the metal tin poster thing for my birthday. And there's still lots of little details here that I love that the camera probably won't pick up. Like between the armor, you can actually see cross-hatched muscles. You can see the smoke off Samus's gun going into the sky and turning into stars. But what really impressed me was the fact that you could see into her visor and see a reflection of the environment in front of her. So that you could kind of see that there's this amazing world just out of reach, a world of possibilities and endless sci-fi nonsense. And I always wanted to check that world out. Still haven't. And for the longest time, I didn't even know who Samus was. I just knew that there was a weird spaceman on a poster I loved when I was a kid, and it wasn't until I played Smash Bros. That I recognized her. So yeah, my dad won this Game Boy, plus 2 games and that poster in a contest. And what does he do? Immediately turns around and tries to sell it to anyone else at that party because he hates video games that much and didn't want to give it to me. Because that's just my family for you. But he failed to do so, and he had to give it to me. So that's nice. And even though I only had like 4 games at the time, and even though half the pixels, like just the rows of pixels themselves are completely dead on this thing, I really would love to replace the display on this. Even though the battery door is missing, even though it barely works anymore, this thing is an amazing thing, and I have so many fond memories of this Game Boy. Now, Game Boy Color, I don't have really much of a story, because I actually got this in 2015. I never had a Game Boy Color growing up. I went straight from Game Boy to Game Boy Advance, and while I had a few Game Boy Advance games back in the day, like I said, they worked on the Game Boy, so, you know, are they Game Boy, are they Game Boy Color? I don't know. But I can tell you a very special story about the very first pure Game Boy Color game I got. And it ties into the story of my Game Boy Advance, which, like my original Game Boy, has no battery door, and unfortunately I can't play anymore because the D-pad is completely dead on this. In fact, I think half the buttons are because I just played this thing into the dirt. Game Boy Advance was such a cool console to me because it felt like a full-on console just shrunk down to handheld. Because before this, you know, games were slower than their console variants, or they just weren't anywhere near as big. Here it felt like you got full-on console in your handheld, and that's why I love the Game Boy Advance so much. And my story about the Game Boy Advance is pretty simple. I was about 10 or 11, and I was going across the country to meet my grandfather for the first time. Although, to be fair, he didn't really want to meet me. He wanted to meet my little brother because, like my YouTube channel in the universe, my family didn't take a lot of interest in me. But I had to go with the rest of my family, and there was a new game coming out that I absolutely wanted. There was a problem, though. It didn't work on the Game Boy. It was a Game Boy Color only game, and I didn't have a Game Boy Color. But the Game Boy Advance had just come out. So I saved up my allowance for a very, very long time to get this game and this Game Boy Advance. Unfortunately, the game itself wasn't out just yet. So I had to go to a Zellers and just pick out a Game Boy Advance to take on the trip, and we were going to get the game on the trip. Clear Kirby Watermelon Pink was the only Game Boy Advance they had, and I got it, and it was awesome. I played it all the way across the country. And when we got there, well, we saw something that still haunts my nightmares today. See, my dad, for whatever reason, decided he wanted to camp at a lake. And, well, camp, he wanted to rent out a cabin by the lake. And that lake was horrible. It was filled with black flies, which, if you're not familiar, they're like house flies, except they have a hunger for human flesh, and they're wildly aggressive. They were all over the place there. And we went to this cabin, which we were just going to hide from the flies in, and I saw something terrifying. See, we opened the door to this cabin that we were renting, and we were met with a solid sheer wall behind that door. And if you looked at that wall, you realized something. It was pulsing. See, that summer, I guess there was a lot of caterpillars and moth larvae growing, and they decided every moth and caterpillar larva in the country had to live in this one cabin, because every square inch there was just like 18 of them crammed together in cocoons, so that they made a single, like, solitary, solid block all the way through the thing. I remember looking like the little deadbolt hole in the door, and I saw like 8 crammed in there. Like, there were just so many cocoons that it made a solid wall, and there wasn't even like an ounce of space that you could look through a window. It was disgusting. It was something out of like a Geiger nightmare. Like something out of Alien you'd take a flamethrower to. And to this day I still sometimes get visions of it. So my mom, understandably angry about this, decided she was going to take me into town so I could buy my game. Whereas my dad had to talk to the person renting out the cabins at the lake to deal with this problem. So I went to a Zellers on the other side of the country, and we found my game, and I never once stepped outside that really gross cabin after they cleaned it up and it was less gross, because I didn't want to get eaten by black flies, but I was playing my Game Boy Advance. And that was one of the biggest gaming sessions I ever had, I remember. I probably have spent thousands upon thousands of hours in this, and I was playing one of my favorite games on the Game Boy Color that we're going to take a look at in a sec. So let's get these out of the way. Crack this thing open and see what we have inside. Alright. So it looks like, starting off, we're going to have Nubo, I know you can't tell from the cover, but this is Nubo, which is like a step platformer point-and-click adventure type thing on the Game Boy. It's a really cool import. It's very, very rare and hard to find. I made a video of it forever ago, and it's a really genuinely cool game. You play as this cute little blob creature, which I want to say was a mascot for a chocolate wafer confection company. And he would basically wander around these environments, collecting objects, building steps, and solving people's problems. It was a very, very simple game, but unbelievably charming. And this was part of a thing I did several years ago now, where I got really obsessed with about 5 different Game Boy game imports, and this was one I really had to have, and I'm very happy I have this. It's very, very cool. If you're into imports, try checking out Nubo. Very expensive, hard to find, but worth it. Next we have Wario Land 3. I haven't played a lot of Wario Land. I remember I got this in a box at a yard sale for about 50 bucks, along with about 20 other Game Boy games. And this was a really, really cool game because it's actually tied in with a game I'm far more familiar with, the Mario Land series. And Wario Land was particularly interesting because it is a 2D platformer, but Wario himself can't die. Instead, every time he gets hit by an enemy, he changes into a different form that can solve more puzzles. It was really, really creative. And I mean, I assume the other games are like that too. I haven't really played them, but I know people go nuts for the Wario Land games, and Pizza Tower, which came out recently, which is very, very similar. And this is a series I'd really like to get more into. But Wario Land 3, this was a game I got for dirt cheap. I've heard it's very, very good. I've spent a little bit of time, and so far I've been impressed with. I'd like to make a video on it at some point. So next we have a game I'm completely cursed with. This is Tetris. This is a game I'm awful at. It's a game in a series I wish I was good at. It's a game in a series I am completely cursed at because I think I bought about 60 to 100 different games of Tetris. And with this exception, which is one I got at a yard sale for $1, they were all broken on arrival. I cannot get a functioning game of Tetris. For some reason, the universe just doesn't want me to have Tetris. And to be fair, I am awful at Tetris. It's a puzzle game, which I'm terrible at, and I'm especially bad at this falling block ones where you have to move quickly. But I remember my aunt playing the NES Tetris while running on a treadmill at the same time, and I was just so impressed by that. Tetris, very, very hard game, but I think it's a must-have. I just can't play to save my life. So next we have a game that I've heard a lot of good things about. We have V-Rally, and I believe this was in the same box as good old Wario Land. And I believe this was part of one of those, there was a trend on the Game Boy Color where they created sort of not quite Mode 7, but almost sort of Mode 7 3D racing games, and this was one of them. I've heard really, really good things about this, and it's one I'm gonna have to talk about at some point, I think. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I got a lot of Game Boy games to show off in the very first loot video I ever made, which was at this local garage sale. And they had so many Game Boy games, and a lot of them were Japanese, so I don't typically know the names of them. And I haven't spent a lot of time, but this does talk greatly about who I am as a person, because while I might not have played all these games, and I have played some of them a little bit, I spent afternoons researching these games, because what is this game? Well, I can't read Japanese. We know it's by Human, and it came out in 1992. Quick, what is everything they put out in that time? Let's find out. And this is this collection of games I got at that one yard sale that were all Japanese Game Boy games. I feel like that is a perfect amalgamation of how I love to research games sometimes. You find something weird, and you might spend more time researching it than you do actually playing it. And I think that's pretty cool. I think that's part of my thing. It's I love research. Next is a game I actually have I have a boxed copy of, but we have Super Robot Pinball. Now, I've reviewed this because it's honestly one of my favorite Game Boy Color games. Super Robot Pinball, if you're not familiar, which means you should go watch my video on it, it's kind of like Pokemon Pinball, except instead of Pokemon, you have Gundam and the Ava Unit 1, the various Mazingas, all sorts of Gundams. It's basically Tokusatsu versus Mecha, in pinball form, and it's genuinely one of the best pinball games I've ever played. Seriously, if you can get a copy of Super Robot Pinball, do it. It is one of the best Game Boy Color games you can find, and one of the best pinball games you'll find. And I'm not that big into pinball or pinball games, but this is one of two I love to play, and it's one of the games that makes me really want to get like a GBA SP just so I can carry my GBC games around and play them anytime. This would be an amazing anytime game. Alright, so I mentioned how there was like 5 Game Boy games I got really obsessed with importing. This is another one, and it's another one I've reviewed. This is Ultraman Ball. Now, if you're not familiar with Ultraman, and to be fair, I'm not very familiar with Ultraman, it was like the story of this alien giant who fell to Earth and accidentally killed a human, so he fused with the human and they became a superhero, kinda. This game presupposes that Ultraman, instead of colliding and killing a human, he collided and killed a rubber ball. So instead you play a little SD chibi Ultraman who can turn to a little bouncy ball and bounce around stages. It's a very, very short game, but it's a fantastic little import. You don't need to understand the language at all. And I'm pretty sure this is actually originally designed as a sequel to a Famicom game I have called Armadillo. I think this was like a stealth sequel that has like a license applied to it. Very, very certain this is actually supposed to be a sequel to that. But either way, Ultraman Ball, very, very fun game. Not super, super long, and it's hard to find and pretty expensive, but it's definitely a good Game Boy game, and I quite like it. So next we have another game I got in that box at that yard sale. We have Street Fighter Alpha. I'm not very good at the Street Fighter games in general, but this game impressed me because it was one of 2 Game Boy games I've played that were fighting games that actually were relatively well paced. See, my experience with Game Boy fighting games was all games that I played with people I knew, and it was pretty much always Street Fighter 2, which was a very, very slow game and cut half the characters, or Mortal Kombat, which was basically unplayable. The Game Boy was a very, very slow system, which is why it wasn't really great for high-speed games, and fighting games were pretty much all universally crap. This one, from what I remember, is actually quite well paced and quite good. It's actually quite a playable fighting game on the Game Boy, and it might be one worth tracking down for sure. Next we have Disney's Tarzan. I don't know how I have this. I don't think I've ever played it. I rented the N64 one once, and I remember not enjoying it, but really the only thing I really remember about that game is in the manual to it, they mispronounced the word thugs as thungs, and that is more memorable to me than anything else in Disney's Tarzan, so there's that. Next is a repro card I've got. This is Trip World, and it comes with this really nice ice blue shell. If you're not familiar with Trip World, you might be familiar with a game called Gimmick. This is kind of basically the Game Boy stealth sequel to Gimmick, more or less. It's by the same team, it's by Sunsoft. As I understand, they're actually re-releasing this on modern consoles, and I might have to try and track down a copy. I've heard Jet Wolf's getting a copy. I'm kind of jealous because I actually quite like Trip World. But if that's not enough Trip World for you, the character from Trip World, I believe, was also in Galaxy Fight? I'm pretty sure it was Galaxy Fight. If it wasn't Galaxy Fight, it was one of the other Sunsoft fighters that also came out on the Saturn. Galaxy Fight was awful. But Trip World isn't. Trip World is actually quite cool. Next we have, I believe this is the Compata Heroes 2D fighting game, which I believe is called Versus Hero. I'm pretty sure I reviewed this forever ago. I love the Compata Heroes games, and man, I have got to talk about them, because I haven't talked about one in probably years now. But I kind of want to collect all of them. This game is not worth playing though. There's only like 2 Compata Hero games I've played that aren't worth playing, and it's for the same reasons. It's because they're either fighting games or beat-em-ups where you play SD characters who can't reach their opponents, and that's what this is. It's a very badly balanced, really awkward fighting game. Not very good. Next we have a game I made a gameplay video about, but that's about it. We have Armorines Project Swarm. I believe I got this in a bundle I ordered from Australia. And Armorines, this is a game that several people have actually recommended I review, but like the console version, which is like this super jankety-ass FPS. I've played a little bit of it on my N64 multi-cart, and it's kind of a weird game. This one eschews being a first-person shooter because Game Boy Color, and instead was a like top-down adventure game. it didn't work super well. I made a gameplay video about it. That's about the extent I've touched this. But it was cheap. It wasn't even what I really wanted in the bundle that I bought. It was just sort of a bonus thing, so you know, there's that. Alright, next we have this little obscure series called Pokemon. This is Pokemon Ruby. This is, to date, my favorite Pokemon game. I noticed that there's a lot of like graphical touches and stuff in Pokemon Ruby that haven't existed since then. Like, there's an area you can walk in, you'll see like the grass quiver over like a wave of wind. You'll see like your reflection in puddles and stuff. Very cool effects in this game. But I remember this game coming out, and it came out right in the middle of summer, if I remember correctly, or at least I got it in the middle of summer. But I remember going to IGN basically every day in the middle of junior high, and I had they were releasing new information every single day about this and Pokemon Sapphire, and I was gonna get Sapphire because I thought the monster on the cover, Kyogre, was so cool. And to be fair, he's infinitely better than Groudon. But they did this little piece of this little exclusive monster called Mawile. And Mawile was the very first pure steel type, which they've since retroactively changed because now it's a fairy type, and I cannot understand fairy type to save my life. But Mawile was one of my favorite monsters of all time, still is. I made a list of my favorite Pokemon at one point, and this was one of my favorites, and that was the reason why I had to have Ruby. And I think it's still like the best looking Pokemon game. It's like one of the best playing. I did a Let's Play of this that's kind of been stalled for years because I think my save data is corrupted, but I'm gonna see if I can try and recover it or something. But Pokemon Ruby, I remember getting it in like the middle of a summer vacation, and I was about to go on vacation with my grandparents, and we were leaving super early in the morning, and I was about to go, and I finally got to play this because I bought it, but I wasn't allowed to touch it until I went on vacation with my grandparents. I spent an 8-hour car ride just playing this game. I remember finding Mawile, I remember getting a Ralts, because it was like my second encounter in the game, and that became one of my favorite monsters. Twice, actually, because I love Gallade and Gardevoir. Pokemon Ruby, I've just got so many memories with this game, and it means so much to me to have this. Alright, what do we got next? This is a game I got pretty recently. This is Bomberman Jetter's Collection, but that's not what I bought it for. See, I actually bought this on eBay under the name Some Bomberman Game Boy Game. And the description of the sale was, "This is some Bomberman Game Boy game. I don't know which one. If you can tell me what it is, I'll be happy to change it and charge you what it's worth." And I guess no one picked it up from this person because they sent me a deal saying, "Hey, we noticed you looked at our page. $1?" And I said yes, because I'm collecting all the Bomberman games on handheld. In fact, I'm pretty close though. I'm only missing 2 pre-DS Bomberman handheld games, and technically they're alternate versions of games I already own, so technically I have them. But this was a minigame compilation tie-in to the Bomberman anime that if you've never seen, you should, because it's hilarious, and actually quite a solid little anime. Never dubbed though. But it's a minigame collection. It's not the best Bomberman Jetters game. I think the other Game Boy Advance game, which was kind of like Bomberman Tournament or Bomberman Quest, would be a better game. But for a minigame collection I got for $1 that helps complete my Bomberman collection, I would say it was okay. Not great, but it was $1, so why not? What game shall we grab next? I guess we'll pick up whatever this is. Okay, so this is Pokemon Silver, except it's Version Argento. So here's the deal. This is the weirdest possibly thing I've ever experienced in my life. I had Pokemon Silver. I got it the day it came out because I really wanted to play Pokemon Silver, and everyone in my school made fun of me because, you know, when you compare Silver to Gold, Gold's clearly the better one because it's rare metal, but I was the only one who had like half the things in Pokemon Silver, so who was the real fool? But you'll notice that this is an Italian version. See, when I was probably in junior high or high school, my grandparents took a trip to Italy. And when they were doing this, I was actually playing through Pokemon Silver again because it's one of my favorite Pokemon games of all time. And weird thing was, my copy disappeared without a trace while they were out on vacation. And they came back, and they said they found something weird in a bus seat. And they pulled out this. So I lost my copy of Pokemon Silver, and instead got an Italian copy they just stumbled upon as I lost mine. But the weirdest thing of all, the player name and a lot of like the monsters and stuff were the exact same types that I was using. So I might have some kind of weird suave Italian doppelganger, is what I'm saying. And he might come for revenge because I have his Pokemon game. But I've been playing a little bit of this. It's entirely in Italian. You can't modify the language or anything, but I've been trying to learn a little bit of Italian from this, and it's kind of working a little bit, just because I know what stuff is in English. But I have so many fond memories of Pokemon Silver. I remember at one point setting up a tent and camping out with someone I knew, and we were just playing Pokemon Silver and Gold together, just trying to get through the game. And for some reason, that's such a magical memory to me. And I've got so many memories of playing like the original Pokemon with that person too. But I love Pokemon Silver a whole lot. Our next game is, what do we have over here? It's a red cartridge. It might be Pokemon Red. I might have held my Pokemon right next to each other. And it is! It's Pokemon Red! This was the very first Pokemon game I ever had. Not this cartridge. Unfortunately, someone stole my original Pokemon Red, and I'm still very upset about that, but I spent so much time playing Pokemon Red. I mean, it's got my favorite Pokemon of all time, Charizard, on the cover. He's my boy. 151, classic. So many monsters, so many possibilities. I remember learning about Missing No and playing around with that glitch a whole bunch. I remember staying up late with the same person who I played Pokemon Silver with, trying to go into Safari Zone and figuring out how to catch a Kangaskhan, and I swear we stayed up for about 12 hours. Like, we went from like 8 p.m., which was like our bedtime because we were kids, to about 8 a.m. trying to get a Kangaskhan, and like all the Safari Zone. Couldn't get any of them because we were awful at Safari Zone. I've got so many fond memories of Pokemon. But Pokemon Red, that one is very nostalgic for me. Next we have, Pokemon Crystal. I got this expressly because I wanted to do a Let's Play of Gen 2 Pokemon, and my Pokemon Silver was in Italian, which I think people might not have appreciated. And I was told that Pokemon Crystal was just a straight up upgrade because it's like the best one because it came out after Gold and Silver, and for the most part that's true, except that they got rid of Mareep, which is one of my favorite Pokemon, and I find that weird that that's a version exclusive to the other two versions. I'm sad about that, but otherwise Pokemon Crystal is quite good, but I like Silver more because you can at least get Mareep in it. But it has Suicune on the cover, which was a monster that no one knew how to pronounce. I always loved Suicune, favorite of the elemental dogs, although let's be honest, they were all kind of crap. Especially compared to like the first set of elemental birds, and that includes Moltres, which was crap too. But Suicune, I loved Suicune's design. I love the giant diamond on its head. When I was a kid, I think I tried to pronounce it Suicune, because I didn't have any idea how to pronounce it. Also, there's a little letter M that's carved into the label there that I've never noticed before. Huh. Either way, Pokemon Crystal. Bought it for a Let's Play, and it was fun. Next we have Perfect Dark, and this actually has a built-in, I believe that's a Rumble Pack. I've actually not played this. This came in a bundle of other stuff. I think this was from my box from Australia I ordered, which was mostly for some weird like pirate game nonsense, but this looked interesting. Never really had a chance to play it though, and I didn't want to have to try and like get a battery for a Rumble Pack. That seemed like a huge hassle, but I think that is supposed to be a top-down shooter, I think. Next game is Pokemon Blue. It's like Pokemon Red, except less cool because it doesn't have Charizard on the cover. Although if you got the Japanese Pokemon Blue, it's a straight-up upgrade to the other games, and, you know, our Pokemon games were based off that, because their Pokemon Green is actually not that impressive. It was a whole lore thing back when I was a kid. I would like to actually get Japanese Pokemon Green just to have the full set, and Japanese Pokemon Blue to have the upgrade, but still, it was one I got after Red, and I don't really know why other than I didn't have anyone to trade with, so I figured I'd get both. Next we have Perfect Chorokyu. This is one of Takara's Chorokyu games. I have made lots of videos on Chorokyu. Haven't made one on this one, I don't think. But from what I remember, this is one of those Chorokyu games that is primarily a minigame compilation. So you're playing like little SD cars that play golf and other minigames and stuff. I remember it being pretty good. I haven't played too much of it though. because language barrier and stuff. Our next game is Tasmanian Devil's Munching Madness. Again, this was from Australia, I believe, and this was $1. I played a little bit of it. It's a subpar licensed game. Not much to really say about it. Next game is, this one is weird. Let's see if I can zoom in on it. Here, this is Ninja Skyscraper Fight, which is the Game Boy Ninja Gaiden game, which was in and of itself not actually a Ninja Gaiden game. It was a sequel to Shadow of the Ninja on the NES. But what makes this one rather remarkable is Ninja Skyscraper Fight is like the gringo Chinese, like, I don't think it's a pirate version, but I'm not sure it's 100% on the level either. But it's like the weird sort of knockoff Chinese version of that. And I thought that was weird. But I got that in that local garage sale that had a bunch of weird imports. And I remember thinking, that's a weird name. I don't know what this is. I need it. And that's kind of what it is. Next we have Mr. Driller. I reviewed this forever ago. I don't remember how I got it, but I don't think I spent very much money on it because I'm not super into Mr. Driller. It's sort of like a sequel to Dig Dug, except it plays nothing like Dig Dug. The only sense that it's a sequel is you're playing as Dig Dug's kid, basically. But Mr. Driller, you basically have to drill down a bunch of colored blocks to get to the bottom, all without suffocating through oxygen deprivation or getting crushed. So that's a good feeling. Oh wait, no, that's horrifying. But it's colorful and interesting. But it's a very, very basic Mr. Driller game. So, you know, if you're into Mr. Driller, you might be disappointed with how very, very bare bones this game is. Alright, our next game is, I have no idea what this is. Again, this is one of those weird Japanese imports I got at a garage sale for basically nothing. Not sure what it was, but Taito released it in 2001. That's about all I can say about it. But I think this was a monster catcher. There was a bunch of like weird RPGs around this time, some of which I've played quite a few of and I quite like. Okay, so this is Micromaniacs. I have a weird history with Micromaniacs. This is another game I got in that bundle from Australia. And I wanted that bundle for a bunch of pirate stuff, but also this expressly. Because when I was a kid, I went on foxkids.com. I was very, very poor, so most of my gaming was done through Flash stuff. And they actually had a tie-in with Micromaniacs. Now, if you're not familiar with Micromaniacs, trust me, no one is. But it was sort of like an edgy reboot of Micro Machines, except instead of cars, you played like little cartoon characters running on foot. It was a PS1 game I'd actually like to play at some point, but they had really cool Flash animations and a few really good games on Fox Kids. And I always wanted to try it. In fact, I remember, this is really embarrassing, but one year when I was in elementary school, I actually dressed up as him for Halloween. Which is a little bit of embarrassing lore about myself. But basically it's Micro Machines, but you're people on foot with attitude. I'd like to try the Game Boy or the PlayStation version, but this one is very, very jank and weird, and you can't really tell any of the characters apart because it's Game Boy Color, and they really compress all the characters' visuals. You're basically like a bunch of little stick figures running around. I think I've got a gameplay video of this up. Not a great game, but it is a Micro Machines game, and those are still fun in their own right. Alright, our next game is going to be, I don't know what this is. Again, this is one of those things that got in that weird Japanese bundle, and I spent like a day studying, trying to figure out what it is, identifying it, and then probably never playing it. But if I ever actually figure out what this stuff is, I guess I'll have to look it up in post. If I can figure out the names, I'll show them. But this is just another one of those weird Japanese games I grabbed. Mainly because the cover looked weird more than anything. Alright, our next game. Okay, this game's important to talk about. So, remember how I said that there was 5 import Japanese games I really wanted to get that year? This was the king of them. And you know how on eBay you'll see people charge ridiculous prices, and because people are stupid, they're like, oh, people are asking for that much, that's clearly what they're worth, right? If I may channel that moment as a sense of validation for me, with that being some sort of calculatable metric, this may very well be my single most valuable game. This is Painter Momopi. This is my favorite Game Boy game. This is a very rare Japanese import only by Sigma, and as far as I can tell, this is the only game they ever made. I remember trying to find this game on eBay, and usually you'll find 1 or 2 copies at a time out there, and it's usually for about $100 or so. But at one point, I was talking to Vermilion on the Discord, and we were trying to figure out how much this was worth because I was trying to add it to my price charting account, and price charting couldn't find this, and I couldn't see any copies on eBay. He suggested I go to Yahoo Auctions Japan, and I saw 1 copy on there. It was in worse condition than this, and because they were asking for it, clearly it's worth that much money. This game is worth apparently $1,600. You know, forget my copy of Gotcha Force, forget my copy of Cubivore, Painter Momopi might be the most valuable game in my collection. But this is actually, in all seriousness, my favorite game of all time for the Game Boy. If you want to be very, very reductive about it, it's kind of like a Pac-Man clone. You play as this cute little witch who, I think she's supposed to be painting the floor. Like, that looks like kind of like a paint roller, but in-game it looks like a push broom, so it looks like she's sweeping the floor. But she's basically sweeping the floor of this castle using magical spells to defeat monsters that are tracking footprints on her painting, or her sweeping, or whatever. And it's just an unbelievably cute game. It's a very, very refined game. It's very, very cute, and this is probably my favorite Game Boy game of all time, and certainly, apparently, my most valuable, because it's definitely worth that near $2,000. People asking for absurd amounts of money online are destroying the one thing I love more than anything. Well, that and those, what are they? VGA, auction certified game raider people, those people too. But they're also a massive scam. But Painter Momopi is unbelievably good, and if you like Pac-Man games, you should find this because it's unbelievably charming. There are some weirdnesses to it though, like when you kill your X number of levels, you get like a little scene where you get to pick one of 3 presents, and I think it's supposed to be like a magic spell you can use on your opponents, but it doesn't seem to do anything. I don't know what that screen's all about, but otherwise it's a really, really fun game. And it's just a very, very cute and clever take on the whole Pac-Man, maze clearing, cover every spot on the floor type of thing. If you're looking for a really solid pickup for your import Game Boy collection, grab this one before anything else. Except it's really stupid expensive and hard to find. Okay, our next game is going to be... Ooh! Alright, this is Mega Man X-Treme 2. Boy, do I have a story for this. I still have the manual for this somewhere. Mega Man X-Treme 2 was the sequel to Mega Man X-Treme. This was a game that, for the longest time, was the only Mega Man game I owned. I grew up with Mega Man. Mega Man 7 was like the first game I ever rented, and it was probably the game I rented more than anything else. And Mega Man X2 on the Super Nintendo was my second favorite. I rented it all the time. Unfortunately, I have neither of those thinking about it, but when I heard that there was basically a Game Boy Color version of Mega Man X2 coming out, I had to have it, and this was like the only thing I wanted for Christmas the year it came out. And I did actually get it for Christmas, which is really, really cool. You can play as both X and Zero, but what's weird is until you beat the game with both of them, you only get half a game. Because X gets 4 different Robot Masters, Zero gets 4 different Robot Masters, and they can only fight the 4 they've been assigned. Until you beat the game once with each, then you can play as both characters at the same time, swapping whenever you want, going through all the stages to collect all the powers. It's kind of weird though, because only one character will get like the power from the Robot Master they defeat, so you really have to kind of just stick with one character, which kind of sucks. And similar to Mega Man X1 and 2, there's actually a special superpower for X that Zero doesn't get, and it's only available in X's half of the final dungeon, so you kind of have to basically end as X if you want to collect everything as well, which is kind of unfortunate. But I like this game. I think it's very, very janky, and it's a weird amalgam of X1, X2, and X3 in terms of its enemies. But I still really, really fondly remember this game, and someday I would like to talk about it a whole bunch, because I do love Mega Man X-Treme 2. It's a very special game to me. Our next game is going to be Mega Man X-Treme. This was a game that I got in that box with Wario Land 3, and this was actually expressly why I wanted it, because I have such a love for X-Treme 2. I want to see what X-Treme 1 was. At which point I recorded a gameplay video of it, and that was about all I ever did with it, because it wasn't that good. Basically, it's like X1 and X2, but like super low quality versions of X1 and X2. It's definitely like the Game Boy amalgam, sort of like how the Game Boy Mega Man games were. But it was interesting, and I don't regret having this. I got this expressly because I loved Extreme 2 so much. So having this was very important to me. But it's not that great. Next we have, I believe this is Metal Walker on the GB, which is an RPG I talked about forever ago. This is a very strange little RPG because your characters are basically billiard balls that you have to like shoot into your opponents using physics in the environment. It's a very weird RPG, and if I remember, it's kind of really awkwardly paced, but it's a fun game and it's interesting. And if I remember, I think there was like a Wonder Swan One Piece game that took a bunch of inspiration from this game as well, or vice versa. But either way, very weird RPG. Our next game is, first one of the set. This is Medarot Kuwagata 5. This is possibly the best Metabots game ever made. Unfortunately, it's only in Japanese. I am a huge fan of Metabots. Watched it all the time when I grew up. Rokusho, the Kuwagata or Stag Beetle, is my boy. And I made a point to get every single Metabots game that ever came out in the Rokusho or Kuwagata Stag Beetle version. And I've got almost every one that's available for a region-free system. I believe the only one I'm missing is the weird North American Game Boy fighting game, which was a reskin of a different Metabots fighting game entirely. But this one is the 5th one in this series, although it's actually probably about the 8th or 9th, because there's like weird interstitial things, plus a console release, and there was like card games, and there was like expansion packs. But the point is, this was the 5th mainline one, and it was one of the most impressive. I believe this was actually released after the Game Boy Advance ones came out, and honestly I think this one's far more impressive. You play as a guy who has to, he finds a like experimental robot in a tree, and he sort of goes out of his way to try and return this robot to where it belongs, but he kind of bonds with it and it becomes his partner, and he fights with it, and he gets to create a team of robots. It's a great series. Hard to play if you don't understand Japanese, although it's one of the more approachable ones. The original Medarot, entirely playable even if you don't know Japanese. And this one, I had a lot of fun with, and I didn't get stuck from what I remember, but I remember this being one of the most high quality experiences in the Medarot series. Unfortunately, Medarot 5 is actually really hard to find and expensive. I haven't checked since I got this, but I remember them going for like $100 each. And that's a bit unfortunate because they're really good games. A little hard to get into if you can't read Japanese, and it's kind of sad because we did get 3 of them in North America. Only one of them plays like an actual Metabots game. But if you're looking for Metabots games, make a point to get this one because it's very good. Probably my favorite. Our next game is Medarot 4. This was a sequel to Medarot 3, which was in and of itself a sequel to Medarot 2 it directly, because you're still playing as Iki Tenryo, who was the main character of the second game, and the anime that was based very heavily on the second game. This is based more, if you're familiar with the anime, based on like that weird final season where all the Metabots were cars. That was more what Medarot 3 and Medarot 4 were all about, and I didn't gel so much with it. I remember these games having weird voice clips though, and a lot of like the emulation and stuff that I play these on just to record them doesn't like that so much. Specifically, I think if I've got these in order, this should be 3. If you loaded up Medarot 3 on half the emulators I have, normally if you put this in an actual Game Boy, it'll be like Medarot 3. Except on like my emulated versions, it'll be like just this random yelling of 3, and it's weird. And the first time I heard that, I just burst out laughing. But yeah, this is Medarot based on the final season of the Metabots anime, where everything was weird and they cut out all the good characters, and all the Metabots were cars. I don't care so much for that chunk of Medarot, to be fair. But next we have RAREST 2 Kuwagata. This is what you probably better familiarize yourself with the anime, because it's based off these games and the weird English recreation of this, which in and of itself got a later recreation in Japan with more content that was cut. Figure that out. But RAREST 2 is a very, very good RPG. It did get a North American release on the Game Boy Advance, and it's a weird updated version, even though there's still like an update to it that makes the version we have a downgrade. Either way, very, very good series. I'm a big fan of the RAREST games. I'd like to do more reviews on them, to be fair, but I need to find the time. And of course, we've got the original RAREST Kuwagata. This now actually has an English translation by a fan group, which is great. But I beat this game entirely in Japanese. It's the very first RPG I ever played that was entirely in Japanese that I got through without a guide or anything, because as far as I know, there are no guides for this. And that's because it was designed in such a very straightforward way. Like, the map would be entirely closed off, and when you cleared a chapter, the next place you had to go would open up. So you kind of knew always where you needed to go. But basically, you had to get a group of 3 robots together to fight other people, and whoever you won a fight with, you'd get a random part from their robots to customize yours. And there were 2 versions of this, hence why it says version. Like the others, it was RAREST Kuwagata, or Stag Beetle, featuring Head Scissors, and his version 2 Rokusho, and the original Kabuto version, which starred Metal Beetle, later Metabe, which, if you've watched the anime, you're more familiar with, but Rokusho's my boy, damn it. But the way they're designed is very, very weird, because the Stag Beetle, these guys here, they're designed to be high-speed melee and support. When they're alone, they're very, very awkward to play as, because they do a high damage, but they're glass cannony. So at the start of the game, when this is all you have, one wrong move will kill you outright. The other character, Metal Beetle, who is designed to be a ranged specialist, he has 3 separate abilities. He's a lot slower, but he has more armor. So he can take more of a punch, and if he loses his parts in combat, he can kind of compromise and use his other weapons. Which makes him a lot better early on. However, once you start building up your teams, the Stag Beetle suddenly becomes a lot less vulnerable and becomes this amazing glass cannon team lead, infinitely better. Basically, if you want an easy early game, like first hour or 2, get the other version. If you want a more fun, harder intro but significantly better across the board, get the Kuwagata versions. And that goes with all of the RAREST games. Next we have Mario Golf. This is a golfing game by the people at Camelot, who made the awesome Shining Force and Golden Sun. That's all you need to know. Next we have, this is an import repro copy. This is Magical Chase GB. If you're not familiar with Magical Chase, it was a TurboGrafx 16 PC engine shmup. And for some reason it had a Game Boy Color version that was not quite the same, but worth playing all the same. It's a very, very rare, hard to find game, which is why I have a repro, which is why it says game up here as opposed to Game Boy. But, you know, repro cards, they cost like nothing. So it was worth it just to get a really rare game in my collection. Pretty solid shmup too. Alright, our next game is another one of those top 5 imports I got really obsessed with. We have Lucal. Lucal is a game I made a review about forever ago. It's kind of a complicated, hard to explain game. Basically, if you've ever been in a math class where you had to use a protractor, you know, like the 2 little points that would pivot around, have you ever used those as legs? If you have, you've played a very primitive version of Lucal. Because you got this little spaceship here that's got like 2 little pods, and one pod will rotate around the other. You plant it in place, and the other one sort of pivots around it. The idea is that you get around these mazes by pivoting the other little pod around yours to get to the end. It's complicated, and it's an execution challenge, and it's weird and random, but it's amazing, and you need a copy of this in your life. Unfortunately, not the most common Game Boy game you'll ever find. Pretty rare, pretty expensive. I believe there was a European version. That's even harder to find, though. But worth it. That's definitely a must-have. If you can. Our next game is Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons. I'm going to say it right now. I think Zelda on the GBA might be the best Zelda games, with the only exception being A Link to the Past. Zelda Oracle of Seasons, if you're not familiar, was originally part of a trilogy, but then that got axed to 2 games, that was put out by Capcom basically using the Link's Awakening as a base game to make its own games. Sort of not entirely dissimilar to how Majora's Mask was kind of made using the assets of good old Ocarina. Basically, Capcom said, hey, we want to make Zelda Trilogy, and Nintendo said, well, why don't you make a remake of the first one, because we kind of want one of those. And they kind of ended up compromising, saying, look, we'll make 2 games, one of them will be a remake of the original, sort of, and the other will be a completely new game. And that's where we got Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. Oracle of Seasons is the remake of the original game. That's why most of the dungeons, and indeed the bosses from the dungeons, pretty much mirror exclusively the original Zelda game. However, they changed up the environment entirely. They added a completely different story. They added connectivity between games. They added so many new features. They added a season system, hence the name, where Link is equipped with an item known as the Rod of Seasons, which is this device that allows him to manipulate what season it is. And during different seasons there will be different weather, different obstacles, such as like in the winter there will be snowdrifts you can walk on to get across rivers and stuff. Very, very interesting, and for a game that was basically a compromise to a compromise to a compromise, it's still one of the best Zelda games I've ever played. I love the Oracle games on the Game Boy Advance. Game Boy Color, rather. Following that up, we have Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages. Now, Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages. I have a story about this one, because this is possibly my favorite Zelda game outside of A Link to the Past. In fact, it is my favorite Zelda game next to that. See, I remember the advertisement for this game coming out, and you should go look it up because I'm sure it's on YouTube. It's really, really well done. Really cool advertisement of just Link using the Rod of Seasons to climb a tower, from what I remember. But this was a game I absolutely needed in my life. But alas, I only had a Game Boy. This was the game that I first got a Game Boy Advance to play. This was the one that I had to go through a horrible Geiger nightmare to play. And while I still have nightmares about it, I still think it's worth it because this is my second favorite Zelda game of all time. This game is amazing. It has the cool time travel mechanic, which gives you like 2 completely different maps that you can change which area you're from. It has a cool body snatching villain in Viran, which I think is one of the coolest villains Zelda's ever had. It has amazing characters, a really cool environment. It is a very, very difficult game, even compared to Oracle of Seasons, which again was designed to be together with this and connected to tell an interconnected story, hence why there's a large password system that kind of sort of half works. This game is significantly more difficult. I remember Oracle of Seasons, for whatever reason, it had very, very late game enemies show up very early, but Oracle of Ages was a completely new adventure that was significantly more difficult. This was the game that basically Capcom wanted to make when they made the trilogy. Well, that and maybe the unreleased Oracle of Secrets, who knows. But Oracle of Ages is possibly my favorite Zelda game, other than A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo, which I don't own. I love this game, and if I had to keep only a small handful of games, this one would be a no-brainer. That's why I needed a Game Boy Advance, and I think I missed one over here. So this is a game that I got as part of that like 5 must-have imports. This is Iron League. I reviewed this forever ago. It's based on apparently like a manga and anime series, which is basically like robots based around sports. So you've got like a football guy, a baseball guy, a kendo guy, a soccer guy, and they run around platforming using like their sports acumen as special powers and projectile attacks. There's weird mini games all over the place. This is such an obscure thing, but it's such an amazing game for your Game Boy. If you can get another import that isn't Painter Momopi, get Iron League. Again, like Nubo. And I think these are pretty much all of the really big imports I got during that time. There was two that I was missing that I always wanted, Tekkaman Blade, and there's a really cool Game Boy Lunar Lander game I'd really like to get as well. But yeah, I think I've talked about all the really cool imports that I got obsessed with that one year. Next we have Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening DX. This was, effectively, it was designed sort of to be Link's Awakening, A Link to the Past on the Game Boy, but it had its own completely different story. It took place in a dream and it was not subtle about it. There was weird cameos all over the place from Mario characters and enemies. It was a very strange game that had a really heartfelt and touching story, especially with, was it Marin, your sort of not quite love interest. This was a very, very cool game, and I wanted it for years, and it took me forever to get it. But I remember a weird memory. I swear I rented this once as a kid, or like the original version, but it was different than how it is. I remember starting in a witch's house, and if you sat there long enough, like this rat that was running around, it would attack you eventually, so I left, and I was in like this huge canyon with all these holes in the ground and stuff, and I could never get past that part. And I wanted to see that when I played this game, but that's not in this game. As far as I can tell, this weird game I remember that I swear was Link's Awakening wasn't Link's Awakening and might not exist. And whenever I see a game that reminds me of Link's Awakening, I try and look into it to see what that is, to see if that's the game I remember. And honestly, I'm not sure if that game even exists. Maybe I just had a weird memory of it, or maybe I played a really messed up version of it. But if you remember a game that's kind of like Link's Awakening that's like that, let me know, because seriously, that's been something that's bugging me my whole life. I swear I rented it once, never saw it again. Weird. Next we have Koro Koro Kirby. For some reason, this is one of my most popular videos, just the gameplay video of me playing this. This is Kirby Tilt and Tumble. If you're not familiar with that, it is Kirby from a top-down perspective where he is effectively a ball at the whim of gravity because there's a tilt sensor, this little gray box here. And yeah, you have to kind of platform Kirby around top-down, rolling your thing using a tilt sensor. What's weird about it is it's got this little, like, gap here. And that gap, if I may, would correspond to fitting into a Game Boy, or would latch, if I can just tweak that, it'll latch there to hold it in place. That means it's compatible with the Game Boy. Except, this game isn't. It's built like it is, it's shaped like it is, it isn't. I don't know why. It's like they made a custom shell, but still made it like classic Game Boy compatible, even though it wasn't. I don't know why. But this game is not really all that fun because the tilt sensor is not terribly accurate. It's very, very, very slippy and hard to control. And I'm not just saying that because when I recorded this, I had to play it on a GameCube to record it because how else are you going to do it? Seriously, this game is weird. It's more of a weird footnote than anything, and the source of most of my views for reasons I can't possibly fathom. Okay, next we have Kirby Pinball Land. It's Kirby as pinball. It's not that exciting really, but I got it for $1 with those Japanese imports from that garage sale. Next we have Kirby's Dream Land. This is a big deal because first of all, this is the very first Kirby game, back when Kirby was white. And still seeing Kirby pink today is weird for me. But this was one of the games that came with my Game Boy. And this was the very first game I ever played on my Game Boy. And it's still one of my favorites, to be fair. It's not a very long game. This is before Kirby even had his powers. He doesn't get to copy anything. He just sucks things in and shoots them out. That's it. Very, very basic game, but this was my very first Game Boy game. And it means the world to me that I still have this. I think I've still got the manual somewhere as well. But I love this game, and I'm glad I still have it. I played a lot of this, and I got stuck in it quite a lot, because fighting Lolo and Lala, if you've never played it, it's taking place on like 3 tiers, and they're running straight at you, so you have to duck under them, and then jump back, and then attack them. I got stuck on that forever as a kid. And the game itself is not that hard, to be fair, but it's Kirby's original adventure, and it's interesting, and it's special to me. Alright, I think this game was called, it was something about It was based on an anime called Goldfish Panic, I think is what it was. I reviewed this forever ago. It wasn't that interesting. You walk around the school and you play little mini games that basically don't work to get little like Yakipan, and that's about it from what I remember. Not a great game, but again, I got it for $1 in that big bundle of Japanese games. Similarly, this is Legend of the River King 3. It's like Harvest Moon, which is why your character looks like the Harvest Moon character, but you're fishing! Unfortunately, it's in Japanese, so playing it's a little tricky because it's also an RPG. But didn't cost very much, and I have a fascination with that series. Okay, this is one that I do actually know a fair bit about because I played this. This was something, it was an anime tie-in with some kind of like Mecha Musashi, if I remember correctly. It's like a top-down Zelda game, except like every environment is like a maze and you have to kind of like get around them. I played a little bit of it. It was confusing to get around, but I had a lot of fun with this. This was a game I remember having a lot of fun with in that bundle of weird Japanese stuff that I mostly didn't know what it was, because a lot of them were like weird strategy games. This was actually entirely like a platforming. It was a top-down adventure game, kind of like Zelda. And while it was nowhere near as good as Zelda, this was a game that I actually thought was quite cool. All the same, I want to point out that we're only about a sixth the way through my collection at this point. Next we have Harvest Moon GB. This is one of the worst Harvest Moon games. Well, one of the worst classic Harvest Moon games. The new ones are pretty all universally garbage. This was a game I got because I was looking for a specific game. I was actually looking for Harvest Moon GB3, which is a Game Boy Color game I have always wanted to get and I still don't have. Which sucks because it's a Game Boy game that plays kind of like a full consoleized Harvest Moon experience. This game is basically if you took the original Harvest Moon on the Super Nintendo, but you took out all the foraging, the town stuff, building up interpersonal relationships with anyone. You were literally stuck on your farm the entire time and you could farm vegetables. And that was it, because they axed everything else. And the saddest thing of all is there's some really cool like bonus stuff here. If you can get through 3 years of this game, you like unlock a umbrella that when used instantly makes it rain, a fishing rod that allows you to fish, which is otherwise a thing you can't do, plus the God Hand, which is like a glove that if you equip you can just throw stuff in your shipping bin at any time. Really cool unlocks. You have to play through 3 years of the most boringest like Harvest Moon experience you could ever find. I reviewed this forever ago, and you know, maybe part of me is just bitter because I've played better Harvest Moon and I really just wanted Harvest Moon GB3, which looks amazing, but I hate this game. And unfortunately, when I called the local place to see if they had Harvest Moon GB3, they said they did when they meant this. And that really killed me because I was really hoping to get that very cool game. Alright, our next game is Harry Potter, Chamber of Secrets. I'm not a big Harry Potter fan. This was sent to me by Nico, though, because he wanted me to talk about it, because it was a kind of an interesting RPG, I guess. I said this in my review of Harry Potter, but I don't like Harry Potter. I mean, for one thing, the, author's a massive turf, which isn't good for a lot of reasons, because everyone deserves, basic rights and being treated like human beings. The person who made Harry Potter's just awful. But I've just never liked Harry Potter as a concept. It seemed overly monarchical. Like, you've got this kid who's great because he was born great but never did anything great himself, and whenever a challenge was brought up to him, everyone else would jump at the chance to just solve his problem for him. I didn't like that very much. But the game is a serious upgrade to Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone in the sense it's actually playable and okay. Not the best RPG ever, though. Next is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, based on the book my mom was crazy about when I was a kid that I couldn't be asked to read because I just got through reading The Hobbit and I thought that was a way better book. This again was something that Nico sent me, and this gave me perspective on how much better that game is, and to be fair, that game is much better. But I remember this game doing something very, very weird because it was incredibly buggy. Early on, you get a little deck of cards, and you can pick which deck of cards you get, because it give you, various, different options as to, which, affinity your deck of cards is going to be. So I picked one, And then the game's just like, alright, cool, and walks off. So I go into my inventory to take a look at my cards, and there's like a view what this does button. So I do, and when I look at what my card does, it instantly drops me into a fight, fighting 3 of myself facing the opposite direction, and then like I just instantly die. It's been years since I've reviewed this game. I still have no idea what the hell happened or why that happened. And if anyone knows anything about this game, please explain the logic to me about that. I am so glad I recorded that. There are so many things just because I have so much space on my computer, I can't record everything. There are so many awesome moments I wish I'd recorded that I didn't. That weird ass glitch is probably the thing I'm proudest I actually recorded, because I have no idea what was going on with that. It was insane. It was one of the weirdest glitches I've ever seen in a game. I want someone to explain it to me. But it was a very awkward RPG, very buggy. There were lots of moments where just nothing made sense. One of your earliest quests is to go to your dorm room, and like you're in a huge tower with lots of secret routes and stuff, and I remember trying to just ask where I was supposed to go, and the most helpful hint I could get was one character said, and I remember this to this day, well, it's about as far away from here as you could possibly get. That doesn't say anything, and that's still the most helpful advice I got in that chapter. That game is not well written, it's not well programmed. Our next game is Hamtaro, Ham Hams Unite. I remember watching the Hamtaro anime growing up. I remember someone on the Zone, when they were first debuting the show, described it as battling hamsters, which I feel cheated because there's no battling in Hamtaro. It's just hamsters, you know, enjoying their best life. But this is a really cool little adventure game where you have to solve problems and find your friends, basically. I think this game is unbelievably charming, and there was actually 2 sequels. Unfortunately, they're both hard to find, and one of them was not released in the US, although it was in Europe, and I would love to get both because I love this game quite a lot. This is one of my more favorite Game Boy Color games for sure. Alright, our next game is... oh god, this is a fishing game. I know this, it's a fishing game. This is another one of those games I got in that weird bundle of Japanese Game Boy games, and that's everything I can tell you other than it's a fishing game. Okay, what do we got here? We have... okay, I know this game. I don't remember its name, but I remember this one being like the one game in that bundle of weird Japanese games that I got super excited wanting to know about, because I don't see any information about what this is in English. Like, I can't see a... There's no date stamp as to when it was released. There's no, this is by this developer or publisher. It's just, here's a game, here's its name, figure it out. And I spent like 2 days searching for this game. And it's not that great a game. It's like a 2D platformer with shooting elements. It's very, very clumsy and bad. But just that like 2 days of researching and trying to uncover the mystery of what this was, that was worth it to me. Alright, this is Grand Duel. It is a card-based RPG, if I remember correctly, and not very good, and that's the extent I could tell you anything about it because it's entirely in Japanese. But I do like collecting weird Japanese titles all the same, as you know. Our next game is GB Harobots. This is likewise a Japanese exclusive RPG, but I can actually tell you what this is. This is a game based on Haro, the little Gundam mascot ball thing, where you make your own custom Haro like a Pokemon, and you have to fight other Haros to be the best Haro. It's a very silly game. It's actually pretty approachable too. I remember enjoying this. I wouldn't mind trying to do more stuff with this because it is such a weird game, and it's not one of the harder games to get into. Plus it was super stupid cheap. I got it basically for nothing. Next we have the GB Genjin Collection. This is a compilation of Bonk, Bonk's Revenge, Bonk 3 on the Game Boy, plus an exclusive Japanese Bonk game. So basically you get all the Bonk in one place. It's the best thing you could ever get for Bonk. And this was my introduction to Bonk, so it's kind of a special one to me. Japanese exclusive, but Hudson did release quite a lot of Japanese exclusive compilations for their Game Boy games. And this one was cool, but it had its own exclusive content that wasn't just the stuff in the collection, so, you know, that makes it more than worthwhile to me. Alright, next we have Ganbare Goemon. This game was unbelievably hard to get a hold of and very, very rare. This is basically like the Super Famicom Goemon 2, except you can play as both Goemon and Abysmaru, and they're stuck on different sides of Japan, so Goemon has to meet up with Abysmaru, and he has to run to the right, but because Abysmaru's stuck on the opposite end of Japan, he has to run to the left, so he kind of has to like reverse platform to meet up together, and ultimately fight space aliens. It is a very, very beautiful Game Boy game. It has some really cool environments, some amazing set pieces, beautiful use of color. This is a must-have for your import collection. Unfortunately, you'll be lucky if you get it for less than $100. This game is very, very, very rare, and I'm very thankful I have it, but it is a must-have, especially if you're into Mystical Ninja. Our next game is this is the Game & Watch Collection 3. I don't think this is the one, but Game & Watch Collection's kind of weird because it was released in North America and Japan, but the numbering was messed up. Like, I think it's the original Game & Watch Collection in Japan never got released in North America, so North America got the second one and labeled it as one. It's a whole mess. But this is one of the Game & Watch Collections, and I have a fascination with the Game & Watch Collections, so, you know, it's cool to have it. I'd like to get the other ones at some point. But we do have the second one as well. So we are missing, I think there's 4 of them on the Game Boy. There's a couple on the Game Boy Color and definitely some on the Game Boy Advance. But, you know, these, if you're not familiar, these were the Game & Watch games, but they had like remixes starring the Mario characters and more details and like more mechanics and stuff. So basically you took the original Game & Watch games, which I think you could play stock, but you basically also got a different version that basically doubles how many games are on here. It's a really, really cool concept. Next we have F1 Race. I believe this was in that bundle of games I got with Mega Man X-Treme for basically $2. It is also one of the Player's Choice Million sellers. Let's see if we can take a look at that little thing to, in fact, say that it says it was a Player's Choice Million seller. And it does actually have a bit of a metallicness to that little award. I don't know how many games actually had that. I think this is the only game I've seen that has it. It's a very simple, like, NES style racing game. It's not all that interesting. I think I reviewed it though. And you have a bunch of different tracks and 2 different cars, and one car is good at straightaways, one's good at turns, so you kind of have to swap between cars depending on what track you're going on, and mastery of those tracks is really where the enjoyment of this game comes from, because there's not much to it. Unfortunately, I didn't enjoy it all that much. Alright, our next game is Evel Knievel, based on the Stuntman, of course. This was a game that was basically the Trials series. Like, if you're familiar with Trials on Xbox and Microsoft stuff, this was that on the Game Boy. It was by Rockstar, apparently. But this was effectively a game where you had to go through little obstacle courses while keeping your rider upright and not crashing, and it was very, very physics-based. It was quite impressive for the Game Boy Color. I didn't enjoy it all that much, but it is a very technically impressive game, and that's worth remembering, I think. Alright, our next game is Dragon Quest Monsters. This is basically if Dragon Quest was Pokemon, although it was done in '98, so it was after Pokemon. But, yeah, Dragon Quest Monsters. I'm more familiar with the DS one, which I enjoyed, but someone stole my copy of. But if you ever want to play Dragon Quest as Pokemon, here you go. Look, you'd also do that with Dragon Quest V, and that was a very good game too. Alright, this is Versus Battler. This game reminded me of a game I played forever ago. I reviewed this, and I was stuck on it because I made that review because this reminded me of a game I played when I was a kid. But I couldn't remember what it was called. And I believe it was a DOS game called Megatron, which was basically a game where you were in this awesome maze hunting down a Battletech mech, and you could turn on your like radar, but then they'd know where you are, so you're kind of like blindly walking around this maze hoping to kill your opponent. This is basically that on the Game Boy, except it plays a lot faster than Megatron. But very, very good game. I quite enjoyed it, although it's a very, very simple game, so don't play it too much for it. But fun if you want a cheap, like, C-tier game. Desperately trying to make sure these games don't fall over. Next we have Donkey Kong Country, or was it Donkey Kong GB? This was Diddy and Dixie. This was Donkey Kong Land 3. However, this was the Japanese exclusive Donkey Kong Land 3 that was exclusive to the Game Boy Color that added color effects and a few other things, but otherwise was basically the same. I actually had the original Donkey Kong Land GB 3 on the Game Boy back in the day. Unfortunately, someone stole it, but I remember wanting Donkey Kong Country 3 so badly because the Donkey Kong series were the only games that my mom would ever play with me. And otherwise, just no one would ever play with me. So I really wanted to get the Donkey Kong Country games, hoping that my mom would come play with me more often. And they couldn't. So they got me Donkey Kong Land, and I was sad and alone. And it wasn't a great game. I remember playing it on the original Game Boy. The colors were washed out. There's one level where it was very, very dark. So you had to, like, hold your Game Boy right up to the light and, like, angle it a certain way. And you had to look for, like, a slight motion blur to know when to jump, because the enemies were super low to the ground and the area itself was very, very dark. I didn't enjoy that game all that much. It's not as good as the full console version, but I think this version's a lot better because it's in color. It's got, like, the inherent contrast of that. But, you know, it's the same thing. It's just an updated version of it, basically. Next game is going to be Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. This was a pretty interesting title because it was basically the original Super Mario Bros. On the Game Boy Color, but with a bunch of bonus stuff added on. There was a bunch of Game Boy printer things you could do if you were one of the people who had one of those things. I'd never met someone who had, but there was also a bunch of different mini games and stuff. There was like a versus CPU thing where you were racing against a Boo, but because it was a Boo, it could go through like walls and stuff, so you had to like play around the levels differently. It was really interesting. I think if you like Mario Brothers, this one's a no-brainer. However, it does have one issue in that it's displaying the entire game on a smaller screen, so you don't get as much of a heads up when an enemy's coming towards you, and the screen feels very, very claustrophobic. But it is a very good game, I think. Alright, our next game is going to be Quest for Camelot. This is a game by Tidus, which is not the best sign ever. This is like a chapter-based, very inept Legend of Zelda game. It's a top-down adventure game where you have to fight people, but everything just feels bad and weird. I think I've made a gameplay video of this, and I haven't wanted to touch this since. I think I got this in my box with Mega Man X Stream, is where I think I got this, because I wouldn't have actually pursued it, but I have it. Next game we have SD Gundam something something. I believe this is a strategy game. I've got a few SD Gundam games, and again, I think I pulled this out of that box from that one garage sale for $1. A lot of the games I got there were Japanese only strategy games, so I haven't had a lot of time to really enjoy them, or even really a chance to. But it's a Gundam game. I like Gundam, so it worked out well for me. Next we have, oh god, Tamagotchi the video game. Okay, I've got a story for this because this is one of like 4 Game Boy games I had when I was a kid. So, if you're not familiar, Tamagotchi was one of the really premier virtual pets. It was like a whole thing. It was the biggest trend for a time. I never got a chance to have one. My parents did get me like a dollar store brand Gigapet after the fad passed, and because the fad had already passed, all the teachers banned them, so I wasn't allowed to take it or play with it or use it, so unfortunately I never really got a chance to be part of this fad, which is why as of like last year I got into like the Digimon virtual pets so much. But this was a game I bought myself. See, my grandmother on my father's side never really met me or spent any appreciable time with me, but for every birthday growing up, she'd send me $20. And because my parents hated video games and made it so they wouldn't get me video games, I had a plan. I was going to go and buy my own video game with the money Grandma sent me. Now, to be fair, $20 doesn't buy much. It didn't back then either, but I made a point to try and buy a video game. And I went to probably about a dozen stores over the course of like 3 different malls all across town. And bear in mind, I'm like 6 or 7 at the time. And it was grueling because I couldn't find anything until I went to a local Toys R Us, which had this in the bargain bin, and it was just enough. So I bought this and took it home, and it was one of the most disappointing purchases I've ever made. I have an hour-long gameplay video of this. I've been thinking about reviewing this. I don't want to touch this thing again, but this was something I bought for myself, and what it is effectively is the first two versions of Tamagotchi smushed together. So it's basically the most bargain basement Tamagotchi, but with a couple of extra mini-games tacked on, and the ability to turn it off. And that's sort of your lot. It's very, very, very dull. And I did it to myself, and that made it one of the worst birthday presents I ever received. Especially because I worked so hard to get that. Like, I went all over town to find it, and after all that hard work and planning to get a game, it just didn't work. Okay, our next game is Sanrio Time Net's Kakuhen, I believe. This is one of two Sanrio Time Net games, and I reviewed, I believe, the other one. I have both, but Sanrio Time Net was a Pokemon-style game. It was released in 1998, and basically, you had two different characters, one in the Kaku version, this one, which is the past version, one in the Mirai version, which is the future version, and your characters would go to the different time zones to collect monsters to build up a tower of time to reconnect the two time zones, effectively. But the thing is, it was very strange because you didn't have to actually, like, collect all the different monsters. Instead, what you had to do was collect X number of monsters, so in theory, to complete the game, at least its slated objective, you could hang around like the first town, just collect the same level 1 Weedle equivalent until you had enough to fix the time machine or whatever. That said, I remember playing these and thinking they were pretty fun. I didn't get stuck in them, and I thought this was a good one, or rather I think the other one was a good one, but I recommended this if you were just getting into importing, because for an RPG it was pretty playable, and I don't remember getting stuck anywhere. And it was a Sanrio knockoff Pokemon. Come on, that's worth something. Alright, next we have Sanrio something, 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 something. I don't know which one this one is. This is, again, something I got in a big bundle at that garage sale for like $1. I think this one is a puzzle game. I'm not very good at them, so I haven't played a lot of time in them. Our next game is Bomberman Quest. Oh no, Pocket Bomberman, rather. You'd think I'd be able to read the own title, but Pocket Bomberman is a game I reviewed forever ago. This was like a Game Boy, well, Game Boy Advance, or Game Boy Color, sort of both, neither. I, again, don't know how to classify these. Prequel to Bomberman Hero. Because it was a 2D side-scrolling platformer take on Bomberman. It was very interesting. It was a little wonky, and it didn't have multiplayer, if that was your whole thing, but it was interesting. And again, it was basically Bomberman Hero on the Game Boy Color, and I think that's worth something. That was genuinely quite interesting, and it's a nice addition to my Bomberman handheld collection. Looks like our next game is going to be this thing. So this is Telefang. I can't remember the full name, but this is Telefang. It would be better known as Pokemon Jade, because someone out in China thought it would be fun to take Google Translate the Japanese text into Chinese, translate that through Google Translate back to Japanese, and then through Google Translate that back to English, and make the most wonky-ass translation of a knockoff Pokemon game ever. There are two versions of this. This is the power version. There's also a speed version. And this was popular enough to actually get a sequel on the Game Boy Advance, which also had two versions. And there's actually an official English translation of this now, and it's actually really, really good. I've made a gameplay video of this years ago. But it's kind of like Pokemon. You collect monsters. You actually call them up using a cell phone in-game. It's a neat mechanic, and just in general, if you want to play an interesting take on Pokemon, the Telefang games are definitely worth a shot. They are really, really cool. And I love collecting like knockoff Pokemon games. Alright, next we have Donkey Kong 94, I believe is the year this one came out. This is Donkey Kong on the Game Boy. Except not quite, because when you beat Donkey Kong at the end of the game, you realize you haven't seen anything yet. And then the game explodes into like an extra 100 levels of completely different mechanics and puzzles. It takes the very simple arcadiness of Donkey Kong and turns it into something significantly more. This was the very first Mario vs. Donkey Kong game, if you don't count the original Donkey Kong game, and it shows. It has a lot more puzzles, a lot more interesting interactions. Mario has a triple jump. He has a hand spring for like flipping and stuff. He has to utilize various environments to solve puzzles and get to the end of the stage to rescue Pauline. This game is a ridiculous value proposition. I think I paid $1 for this, and it has so much gameplay in this. If you're collecting for the Game Boy, I think this one's mandatory. It is ridiculously good. Next we have Donkey Kong Land 2, Diddy and Dixie. This is based on Donkey Kong Country 2, of course. And yeah, this is like the Donkey Kong Land 3, except this is the one based on Donkey Kong Country 2. I rented this once when I was a child, and I really, really loved it. And I wanted to try and get it as an adult, and I got it for like $1. And unfortunately, I don't have the original Donkey Kong Land. I'd really like to get it, but this is a really, really good game. And if I remember correctly, this was the very first time Grant Kirkhope did composition for Donkey Kong, and for Rare. He did the Game Boy version's music of this, and unfortunately, it's missing like my favorite song on the game, which was Jib Jig, but other than that, it has like the best music in the series. It is fantastic, and you know, if you like Donkey Kong Country, it's like that, but handheld and with a whole new suite of levels. You gotta check it out. The Donkey Kong Land games are super legit. Next we have Dinosaur. This was based on a movie I've never seen. I made a gameplay video of this forever ago, and people really watched that, so I might have to make a video of this at some point. I'm not familiar with the movie. I found the game to be confusing and hard to understand. It's like a top-down adventure, but you can swap between characters, but they all have different movesets, but it's like not clear what you need to do. Not a very clear game, not very fun. People seem to be interested in this, so I might have to make a video on it at some point, though. Alright, this is an interesting game. This is one of the Dead Heat fighters. Let's see if we can zoom in a little closer, because my zoom is not very good. There it is. Yeah, this is Samurai Spirit's Dead Heat Fighters. Now, the Dead Heat Fighters was actually a series of fighting games on the Game Boy that took Neo Geo games, -1, and made them SD fighting games. And these were super, super interesting and really well made by Takara. And what's weird is, like, there were 5 of them, and 4 of them were Neo Geo games, and the other was just some nonsense, like, third-party PlayStation fighting game whose name I can't even remember right now, but it wasn't a good game. But yeah, it's an SD fighting game. It's not super, super fast, but it's better than, like, Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter 2, and it was part of a series in the Dead Heat Fighters, although not many people kind of get that it's a series. So that's kind of interesting. In fact, I have a pirate cart that's actually labeled as one of these, which is kind of weird. But if you can get the Dead Heat Fighters, you should try and get them because they're pretty interesting. Next we have Crayon Shin-Chan 2. I don't know much about Crayon Shin-Chan. I know it's popular in Japan. It's been a thing forever. Yeah. I've played, I think it's the 3rd one, which was like this weird hack that was turned into a Mario game that didn't work properly. But this game is a very, very basic platformer from what I remember, and it wasn't terribly enjoyable, but it was cheap. Alright, next we have Cosmo Tank. This is a must-have game. It's really quite cool. It is a top-down shooter that also turns into like a first-person cave exploration game that also then turns into a first-person shooter. I reviewed this years ago, and I think it is unbelievably advanced for its time. And it's really, genuinely an excellent game. I'm surprised because this game was really affordable. I think I paid $1 for it, and this is a must-have for the system. It's not perfect, it's very, very jank because it is a very experimentative game, but I think everyone has to play this because it is just such an interesting title. If you're collecting for the Game Boy, try and check out Cosmo Tank. It is legit. Next we have Chalvo 55. This was kind of the highlight of the Game Boy games I got from that garage sale years ago. This is a weird game because it's a sequel to an unreleased Virtual Boy game. I reviewed this a while back, and it's a neat little 2D platformer where you play as this little robot that can turn to a ball and break blocks to get out of a spaceship and stuff. It's called Super Puzzle Action, and that's because it's both puzzle and action. If you're looking for imports, it's a pretty good one. I would put this on the higher tier of importing. It's not one to be overlooked if you can find it for a good price. Unfortunately, I think it does cost a fair bit now. Okay, this is Bug Sight Alpha by Smilesoft. Similar to the Sanrio TimeNet games, this is sort of a 2-version knockoff Pokemon game. I haven't had a lot of time to play this one, but I know this one was particularly interesting because it actually had a special accessory you connected to your Game Boy Color to, if I remember correctly, I don't have it, but I remember reading about it. If I remember correctly, you connected it to a mobile phone and you could use your data from your mobile phone to like download creatures and fight other people and stuff. Interesting concept. This one I had trouble getting into though. Like I collect a lot of knockoff Pokemon games. This is one I had a little bit of trouble getting into. So next we have Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 3. This is a game that I have no real interest in, but I want to kind of make a dissertation on the series because the Crazy Castle series is weird. Like there's like 6 different games in the series and each one was like released and tied to a different licensed character. Like the original was supposed to be a Roger Rabbit game that then became a Bugs Bunny game. And then the sequel to that was supposed to be a Bugs Bunny game, but then was like a Woody Woodpecker game. And then one of them was like a Mickey Mouse game. And it's like there's no consistency between any of the region's versions or their licensed IPs, but they're all licensed in weird, disconnected ways. It's a bizarre series, and I'd love to do a video on the entire series at some point. I have to collect them though, and they're not great games. So next is Bomberman Quest. This is the Japanese version because the English version costs an absolute fortune. Actually, it's not. It's the PAL version. But it's got the same box art as the Japanese version. Or it's got the same cartridge art as the Japanese version, but it's got the same box art as like the North American version. And it's weird because this is a perfect example of why importing stuff from Europe is such a weird, dicey proposition. I ordered this from, I believe, either Italy or Germany. And it said it was good in French, Italian, and German. But not English. But the box was in English. And it does English, which is weird, but if I remember correctly, it does like English, French, and German, but not Italian or something like that. There's like a weird disconnect between the languages it should be able to do and what it does. Importing from the PAL regions is always a dicey proposition, and that's why I typically, when I do so, have to ask someone I know from that region, hey, will this like do English? Because it's a very, very strange thing to do. I've got another Medarot game in here that was basically the same thing. So next we have Bomberman Max Blue Champion. This was Bomberman. This is kind of one half of the handheld Bomberman games I'm missing, because Bomberman Max was released in 2 versions. There's Bomberman Max Blue Champion and Bomberman Max Red Challenger. The difference is the collectible Charabons, which play a rock, paper, scissors game that's a total waste of time, and whether or not you play as Bomberman in the blue version or Max in the red version. I'd prefer to play Max, but this is what I'm stuck with. But I'm only missing the other half of Bomberman Max Blue Champion, which is the Red Challenger, and the sequel. So it's a weird disconnect. Next we have Bomberman GB3. This is a must-have. I reviewed this last year and it's unbelievably good. First of all, it is the canonical prequel to Bomberman Hero, because the true final boss that no one fought in Bomberman Hero, that I've shown off numerous times on this channel, he was actually the final boss of this game. And that's where he came from, which is why his inclusion in the North American game was a little confusing for Westerners, for the 2 people who ever saw him, because he was locked behind collectibles and stuff. This is a very, very deep and interesting game. First of all, you've got motorcycles that all give you different power-ups. They're kind of like the Louis, like that. But every stage sort of has a different motif about it. Like you can play one level, which is kill all the enemies. Another will be like destroy all the soft blocks. Another will be like avoid getting pushed around by the tide because you're under the ocean. Every level felt unique and different and interesting. I've made a review of this, you should go check it out, but if you're collecting Bomberman for the Game Boy, I think this is the one that's worth collecting. Because the others, Wario Blast was a very basic game, Bomberman GB 1 and 2, those weren't very interesting. This game is a must-have if you're into Bomberman. Speaking of, this is the Bomberman Collection. This is Bomberman GB 1, 2, and 3. Or rather, it's 0, 1, and 2, but not 3. It doesn't have this game in it. This has the other games in the Bomberman Collection, which were like Atomic Punk, Bomber Boy, and one was called Bomberman GB in the West, even though that was GB2. It's a mess how they were named. It's not a great collection because those games aren't that remarkable. Again, Bomberman GB3 out of the original Game Boy set was the only one really worth talking about. But it's an interesting collection and it goes well with my Bonk collection. But from what I understand, this is actually highly collectible now. Oh lord. Okay, so this is Battletoads on the GB. This is pretty much my full extent of experience with Battletoads. But I remember this specifically because this was one of the 4 Game Boy games I owned growing up. I remember exactly when I bought it too, because I was probably 5 or 6. I was just coming home from my babysitters and my mom had to stop at the local drugstore, and they had this at the end of the shelf, like normally where they keep like the toys or like, you know, just the things that grab kids' attention really, and it was cheap, so I begged my mom to buy it because I never seen a video game just sold on the shelf like that in a drugstore. And to her credit, she actually did. And I have never finished this game. The first game, it's very much like the original Battletoads, where it kind of swaps genres between levels, and it's a very, very challenging and difficult game. The first level is a very, very simple but fun beat 'em up. The second level is an unbelievably fast shmup with instant death walls I couldn't get past as a kid. I think I managed to beat that level when I was in high school. But then I got beaten by a level that had like a boulder that would just instantly murder you. Yeah, I've never beaten this game, but this is the only Battletoads I've really ever played. It's very difficult. Alright, next we have, this is Compata Heroes Dodgeball. Compata Heroes actually has quite a few dodgeball games. They had 2 on the Super Nintendo, they had this one on the Game Boy, and they even had a PSP game. Unfortunately, that was a pre-order exclusive game, and I'll probably never get it, which makes me sad because I want to collect the entire series. But if you ever want to play the Compata Heroes, i.e. Gundam, Ultraman, and Kamen Rider in Dodgeball on a handheld, here you go. But there's a Super Nintendo version that's better, if that's really something you want to play. Next we have The Simpsons, Escape from Camp Deadly. I have never finished the first level in this game. This got one of my Poop of the Year list recommendations because this game is unplayably difficult and jank. And it's by Acclaim, which says enough about it being low-quality garbage. Oh, this game is bad. Okay, next we have Balloon Kid. This is an interesting game, because this is a direct sequel to Balloon Fight with a story, but it is also in and of itself a port of a Hello Kitty game on the Famicom. There was a version of this also on the Game Boy Color, available only in Europe, which I'd love to get, plus the Hello Kitty thing. But this is basically a direct sequel to Balloon Trip, which is the best part of Balloon Fight, of course, where the game scrolls and you have to try and avoid obstacles. There's bosses, which is very, very interesting. I reviewed this. It's a really genuinely cool game. If you can find this cheap, grab it, because it is a fun time. Alright, next we have Asmik-kun World 2. I got really into this company, Asmik. They built this really bizarre-ass NES game I'm quite fond of called Worm. I've talked about it in my other collection videos. This is a game centered around their mascot, Asmik-kun, which is like this little dinosaur thing. And I believe that this one, like the first one on the Game Boy, is like a top-down sort of maze game where you have to find like hidden objects to advance the stages. I think there was a third one on this series on the Famicom, which was a 2D platformer. I'd like to get that one as well, just have the whole set, because, of course, I have Asmik-kun World as well, which, again, top-down maze collecting invisible objects kind of game. It's not bad. I think I made a gameplay video of it forever ago. If you can get it super cheap, it's kind of okay. Alright, next we have Power Quest. This was a game I got when I was collecting for the Game Boy Color, because I hadn't really owned any Game Boy Colors for this channel. And I got this game on Amazon for $1, and it was one of the best dollars I've ever spent on the Game Boy Color. This game is ridiculously good. It is a fast-paced fighting game. Like, that blew me away, because again, before this, my entire frame of reference for handheld fighters around this time was the terrible Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat ports. This was fast-paced. There were fun, interesting anime characters to play as. Yeah, there's only like 5 different characters, and there's a lot of grinding in this game, but just for how playable it is, I think this game is worthwhile, and if you can get it for $1, absolutely you should. This is also a port of a Japanese exclusive original Game Boy game, but the only difference is this one has color, basically. Also, the speed type character is the best one because she's got kicks. I love that game. That is one of my favorite Game Boy Color games right there. Alright, next we have Pucci Karats. This is a PAL exclusive version of Pucci Karats, which is a game we didn't get in North America until the Taito collection on the PS2. I made a review of the original version of Pucci Karat forever ago, and I kind of want to get every other version, so I gotta get the PS1 version too. If you're not familiar with Pucci Karat, you should go watch my review. But if you're not familiar with it, what it is kind of like a mix of Breakout and Puzzle Bobble at the same time. You get a bunch of different characters that have different patterns that they can throw at their enemies and stuff. They have just different mechanics and art styles, and it's really quite a lot of fun. I love this series, I love this game. It's not as good as the arcade version, obviously, but they do some interesting things. Because this is a Game Boy Advance game that can play on the Game Boy, you can tell because it has that weird notch in it, they actually modified the game to play on Game Boy to be slightly different than the Game Boy Color version, and not just in the sense that, you know, things would have a black and white tint to them where they would be color. They actually changed the shape of your jewels so that you can better understand what's going to happen and where they go and how they're connected, because, you know, it's a game where you have to destroy connected jewels and you got to destroy mixed types. So finding ones that are the same type, you can create a chain. So they created a special version of this game in this game to only play on the Game Boy, and that is amazing amount of legwork for probably very little profit. But I appreciate it. Pucci Karat, it's awesome. Next we have Kicks. I do not have all that much interest in Kicks. I love Kicks adjacent games. If you're not familiar with Kicks, it's a game where you have to play a little spaceship that draws a line and you have to like cut the screen in half until you've destroyed enough things. I have more of an interest in like the ones that try and turn Kicks into something more than the most barest bones version. That's what this is, but there's a couple interesting versions. The Mega Drive had a few really interesting like sci-fi versions of Kicks that had like giant monsters and stuff shooting lasers at you, which is very interesting. There's a Super Nintendo game called Kakoma Night in Bitsyland, which was like a fantasy version of Kicks that I've been dying to get for years. There's actually a Game Boy Color fantasy version of Kicks called Kicks Adventure as well. I would like to get that as well, but basic Kicks, it's about as blind as it comes. Don't pay much for it. Not a big fan, honestly. Alright, next we have the other Sanrio Time Net game, the one I reviewed. This is the one that's set in the future. I already talked about it, but it's Sanrio Time Net set in the future. So go catch some Hello Kitty Pokemon, I guess. Alright, next we have SD Gundam Lacrosian Heroes. This is sort of a Game Boy port-ish of the SD Night Gundam games that were on the Super Famicom. Or the Famicom. There was a Super Famicom game that was also a port. It's a weird series of RPG card games from what I remember. But I like Night Gundam. I actually have a model of Night Gundam as well. So I bought this. It was super cheap. And I'm hoping to collect more even if I can't play them, just because I think having them in a collection would be very, very cool. We got more SD Gundams. This is, again, I'm pretty sure strategy games and or like RPG card games. That's the extent I can talk about, but I think this is based on the Three Kingdoms lore, like a lot of the SD stuff is. Alright, this one I got at the garage sale for $1. You'll notice that the sticker is completely sideways and that the cart is like this weird purple. Yeah, I don't think this is official in any capacity, but this is Devil Children Red Book. Devil Children, if you're not familiar, is one of like the Shin Megami Tensei spin-offs that was sort of like Pokemon, where you play as a character who runs around collecting monsters. This was like this special version that they made after the others. It was rare and highly collectible from what I remember. And this is, I'm pretty sure, just a weird like bootleg version of it, but yeah, it's interesting if nothing else. Alright, next we have Solar Striker. Solar Striker is a pretty basic little shooter. It's fun and, you know, for a budget Game Boy game, it's okay. Not bad. I wouldn't pay too much for it, but it's fun. Next we have Space Battleship Yamato. This is just a straight up strategy game. I cannot play it to save my life, and I'm actually not familiar with Space Battleship Yamato at all. I should look into it. Okay, I have played some of this. So this is, what is it again? Oh, this is SpaceNet. That's what this is. Okay, so SpaceNet, if the name didn't tip you off, is a sequel to the Sanrio TimeNet games. See, it says SpaceNet right there. This is a sequel to the Sanrio TimeNet games, except they got rid of the TimeNet, or the Sanrio connection. Somehow, the people who made this kept like the ability to make the extended Sanrio TimeNet games, even though they have no connection to Sanrio anymore. I played this. This is actually pretty playable. I didn't get stuck for what little I have played of it. It's quite good. There's a red and a blue version where you play as different characters that have different monsters. Yeah, it's just a playable RPG, and I like collecting Pokemon knockoffs, so here's one that's actually pretty good. Alright. Next we have Super Mario Land. I got this game more recently, and it's weird. I think a lot of people look down on Super Mario Land because of how different it is. It was actually made by a completely different company than Nintendo, or at least a different team from what I remember. And that would explain why it's very, very different. You don't get a fireball in this game, you get a super bouncy ball, which was in Mario Maker 2. It has weird shmup segments that don't quite work. The invincibility theme is now the can for some reason. And you're rescuing Princess Daisy from an evil alien who's a mini-boss in a later Super Mario game. This game is Super Mario Land 2, The 6 Golden Coins. This is the last game I had growing up. This came with my Game Boy along with Kirby. And I remember one of my earliest reviews, I think it was for Roller Games, explicitly. I kind of facetiously said, stop asking me about Mario games, I'm not going to do Mario games, I don't own any. Technically not true, I did own this game. This is the sequel to Mario Land, and it takes a lot more cues from Mario World than the original Mario Land. It's a lot more traditional. It has a lot of really interesting zones and levels. Every zone -1 has like a hidden route and a bunch of secrets as well. You can go to the moon, and there's some awesome music up there. I've used the music from the moon a few times. I love this game a lot. It's really, really fun, and I cannot remember how to get to the pumpkin secret. The pumpkin secret's the one I never could figure out, but there are so many secret levels in this. You have to get 6 coins from 6 different bosses to unlock a door to Mario's castle so that you can go fight Wario in his first appearance. That is a very different chunk of the game. The last level, ignoring the fact that it ends with 3 stacked boss fights, which is a bit much, is just ridiculously hard. It's a pretty simple game up to the final level, which is just stupid hard. I remember at one point I played like the in-game slot machine to get 999 lives or something like that. And I went through all of them the first time I went through Wario's castle because I could not deal with it. It was such a hard level. This game is great though. Like if you're looking for some solid platforming, Mario Land 2, easily recommend this over the original. It introduced the rabbit ears hat, which I'm not a big fan of, but it brought back the fire flower, as well as a few other fun little tricks, and the levels are genuinely quite cool. I really want to talk about this game at some point because it is such a big part of my childhood. But huge fan of Mario Land 2, plus it was like my second Game Boy game. Next we have a repro cart of Shantae in Angry Red. I love Shantae, but I do not have an original copy of Shantae. I wish I did. It is a non-linear platformer where you play as this half-genie Shantae, who has since become a lot more popular because she's had a lot of sequels. This was a game that was released to die on the vine because it came out like right after the Game Boy Advance, and Capcom didn't want to put any like marketing into it, so no one really knew about Shantae, and now it's a ridiculous collector's item, which is why I have a repro instead of an original. But I love the Shantae series. Shantae is one of my favorite game characters of all time, easily top 3 favorite women in gaming. She's just fun and goofy, and her games are always well written and a lot of fun. If you've never played a Shantae game, I recommend you do. The first game is really, really hard though, so just bear that in mind. Next we have Pokemon Yellow, Special Pikachu Edition. This is a weird game because My interest in this game was from two screenshots I saw before this game came out. The first one was that you were fighting an Eevee, which we know was your rival's Pokemon. I thought this meant that you could just catch Eevees in the wild and have a full set of Eevees, which is what I wanted to do the first time I played this. The second screenshot I saw was that you could see Pokemon on the overworld, which I guess must have been an in-development screenshot or something, because that's not really a thing that happens either. But this is a Pokemon game where you can get Bulbasaur, Blastoise, and Charizard all at once through in-game trades, which is kind of weird. But this is a game that exacerbates the problem that Brock is a terrible gym leader, especially at the start, because you now have a Pokemon that literally can't do anything to him. This game has problems, but it's interesting. And it lets your monster walk behind you, which they wouldn't do again until the DS when they remade Gold and Silver. And we are now about halfway through my collection. We are getting straight up into Game Boy Advance territory, exclusively with Shining Soul 2. This was a game sent to me by Jet Wolf. And the thing is, it's hard to see the 2 in the logo. And I'll make no bones about it, I record a lot of my gameplay through my RetroPie or any other console that uses emulation because it outputs to HDMI, which looks cleaner and sounds better. I didn't realize this was Shining Soul 2. I played Shining Soul 1 when I worked on my review, and I was about to ready to review it. And then I looked up the game on eBay like I like to do to give you an idea what the prices are, and I'm like, wait a minute, that's not quite the thing I had. So I had lost basically a week's worth of work. Because I thought this was Shining Soul, not Shining Soul 2. Shining Soul 1 is garbage. Shining Soul 2 is actually... it's not horrible. It's pretty good, but it's not great. It's a sort of top-down action RPG. I would just recommend Sword of Mana, but this one has a lot of different characters that have different playstyles, unlike the original, which had like 4 that all played the same. Infinitely better than the original. But it's not Shining Force, and I like Shining Force. That's my Shining of Justice and of choice. Next we have Sonic Advance 3. It's a weird game because you have to play a team of 2 characters, and there's not really any justification for it. But you can make a team of 2 characters and have them run around the environments together if that's your beat. I think the Sonic Advance games are decent, but not fantastic. Following that up, we have Sonic Advance 2. My uncle got me this in a bundle for $1. Several years ago now, before he quit his job, he had someone in his... well, he worked in like an airplane hangar and repairing planes and stuff, and someone in his business was trying to get rid of a bunch of games, and they brought like a big basket of games, and he ran over to try and grab some for me, and at the end he was worried because he spent $20 on games, and I'm like, dude, I would have just taken that entire basket for like $100. $20 is not that big a deal to me, but Sonic Advance 2 is a game I really wanted because, again, the Sonic Advance games are pretty good, and I think Sonic Advance 3 kind of jumped the shark a little. Sonic Advance 1 and 2 are really, really good, and 2 is probably the best one, I think. Next we have the original Sonic Advance. My copy looks like a dog ate it. It's not as advanced as Sonic Advance 2, but very, very good. Fast-paced platformers that tries to revitalize the series, and it did a pretty good job. I just realized this stuff's kind of in alphabetical order in a weird way. Alright, next we have an amazing Game Boy Advance game I want to review sometime. This is Sigma Star Saga by WayForward, the same people who brought you Shantae. This is a very, very interesting game, and I've wanted to review this for years. Sigma Star Saga is a top-down action RPG and adventure game with random encounters, but the random encounters are shmups with completely randomized ships and stuff, and you can build your own custom like loadouts for your ships and stuff. Genuinely quite interesting, but because the ships are randomized, one time you might get like a tiny snub fighter, and later you might get a flying garbage truck. It's very random. The opponents you fight could be random bosses. It's insane. This game is a must-have for Game Boy Advance games. It's very, very different. It's definitely on brand for WayForward. Get Sigma Star. Easily got to recommend that game. What do we have next? Shrek 2. I think I've got like a dozen Shrek games, and I don't care for Shrek. I don't know why I have this. I didn't get it of my own volition, let's put it that way. Alright, next we have Shaman King. This is Master of Spirits. This is like a platformy hack and slash thing. I'm not very familiar with Shaman King. I know it played on Fox Kids. I know that there was like a Shaman King game that came out in like 2 different versions. I don't remember much about this. I know this was sitting at my local GameStop in a shelf for $1 for years, along with the Yu Yu Hakusho game that I think was probably the game I wanted, because I've been told that's a really, really good game. This game is mediocre at best. I played it like twice and probably won't play it again. Next we have Tetris Worlds. Unfortunately, this is not the cool version on the PS2 that has amazing art by Roger Dean, probably my favorite artist. Seriously, look up Roger Dean's work. He is amazing. But this is probably the only other Tetris game I own. It's more Tetris. I'm not super into Tetris, but it's not even my go-to puzzle game for Game Boy Advance. But you know, it's Tetris. What can you do to screw that up? It's very, very hard to screw up Tetris. It's a proven formula. Next we have Tom and Jerry, Tom and Jerry: The Infernal Escape. I played this once. It's not worth talking about. I got that from the same bundle that my uncle got Sonic Advance 2 for $1. Next we have a game that I actually have been recording footage for months and I just haven't made a video on yet. We have Rebel Star Tactics. This is a game I've been meaning to review. I've got like footage on my computer and it's been sitting there for months, but I just haven't done anything with. This is basically, we wanted to make a handheld XCOM, but we couldn't get the license. And that's interesting to me. It's a sci-fi turn-based strategy game where you take a small team of elite soldiers to fight aliens, but it's very, very anime. Like the main character is just a teenage guy who has like alien psychic powers and stuff. There's some weird stuff in there though, like there's about 1 million different like weapon stats and stuff, and from what I remember, at one point you're in a level where all your weapons are taken away, so you have to use like fist fighting, and unless you've specifically been training in fist fighting, you're kind of screwed and like just stuck. It's got some weird quirks. It's not a perfect game, but you know, the Game Boy Advance didn't have an XCOM, so this might be worth talking about someday, and I certainly have the footage for it. Okay, this game's actually pretty important to me. This is Scourge Hive. This is a isometric kind of sort of Metroid game where you play a lady who gets infected by alien parasites who has to isometrically like go through an environment, gain new abilities, and fight back. This is a pretty important game to me because it was made in my hometown, and I didn't think there was other people in my town making games other than me at the time, so I had to get this, and it's actually a pretty solid game. I've shown off gameplay of this, and I've done a stream or two with this when I was testing out my my EverDrive, and it's an interesting game. It came out on the DS as well, but for some reason, like I think the Game Boy Advance version is harder to find or something. But yeah, it was made in my hometown. I kind of had to have that for some hometown pride. Oh, I'll put that there. Alright, you might not be able to read this title, but this is the Precure game I reviewed years ago, which is like this decently solid platformy punch-up. It's a weird game though, because every level has like secret things that let you build a dollhouse and play hide and seek with your knockoff Sailor Moon girls, as well as play random mini games with your little like stuffed animal mascots. But this is a really, really neat game. It's very simple, super easy to get into. If you can get it cheap, I'd recommend it. It's pretty good, and there's basically no language barrier for it. Okay, so this one I gotta talk about. So, we have 2 copies of Pokemon Emerald. Now, I had meant to do this for a very long time, but it's since kind of become redundant. But, I always wanted to make a video on telling the difference between fake Pokemon games. And these are ostensibly the same. This one's a fake one, this one's real. When I was in high school, for my birthday, I ended up buying myself 4 Game Boy Advance games on eBay. And they were all fake, not this one, but one of my birthdays, my brother actually got me a copy. And when he learned it was fake, he actually gave me this one, which was his. And I've even offered to give it back to him because, you know, it was his. And he just said that I can keep it, and that's very sweet of him. I don't have as much of a connection with my brother as I would like to, and I try to, but you know, that was very, very sweet of him, and I'm very, very appreciative of it. Pokemon Emerald was sort of the Pokemon Yellow of Generation 3, which again, as I've said before, I think is the best chunk of Pokemon. You can get Mawile in this, which is great. The problem is you can't get Mawile until like after you beat the game, so that kind of sucks. But it has a lot of like bonus features and stuff, and I think there was some stuff that let you connect the game to a GameCube to unlock extra stuff as well. But yeah, it's a fake Pokemon cart and a real Pokemon cart with a lot of love included, and I'm very thankful for it. And can I kinda get it under that lip? Yeah, kinda. The whole thing's gonna fall over. Oh no! Okay. We're gonna not touch that, and hopefully nothing's gonna fall over. Alright, our next game is Motocross Maniacs Advance. This was a game that I had a fascination with this series. Motocross Maniacs is sort of like a Trials game, but more of a racing game version of it. You have a motorcycle where you have to race across a stunt track to win a race, basically. And this game is... it's not great. It's okay. I reviewed it forever ago. I don't remember anything about my review, but I remember thinking this game is alright, but not all that special. But it did look very good. It was very visually impressive, and if you want a cheap Game Boy game, if you can find this cheap, it's okay. Next we have Mega Man 03, except this was one of the games I got for my birthday when I was in high school. It's a fake. And there's a lot of ways you can tell it's a fake, but the thing that really tipped me off was the fact that, first of all, it was too thick to fit in my Game Boy without shoving it in real hard. And second of all, I really wanted Mega Man 03 because it unlocked things in Mega Man Battle Network, and this one couldn't. And it was basically, it acted like it was broken, and that sucks. But we have Mega Man 02. And Mega Man 02 I actually have a lot of value in because I think this is the best Mega Man Zero game, but I kind of have an important little story for this. See, I got this game when I was in junior high, I want to say grade 8. It was my birthday, and I went to, ironically, the same Toys R Us that I got that terrible Tamagotchi game years before with my mom. And she let me pick out a present. And I was waffling between either getting Sonic Heroes, because I was collecting every Sonic game on the GameCube, which I've since not been able to do because a few of them have been stolen, or I could have gotten the Game Boy Advance player for the GameCube and one Game Boy Advance game because they were cheaper. So I did. I got Mega Man 02, and it was worth it. Because being able to play these on a big screen, like I said, the Game Boy Advance felt like console games in your hand. But putting it up on the big screen, it felt like suddenly you really could see how these were almost basically console games. And getting the full console treatment just felt so cool. Mega Man 02 has so many unlockables. There were unlockables for beating levels on the highest level. There were unlockables and special abilities for defeating certain enemies. There were customizable armor sets and stuff. There was so much to get in this game. I am not gonna make any bones about it. I hate Mega Man 03, and not just because my copy is broken and fake, but because it was significantly less than 02. 02 is a remarkable game and a must-own. 03, you could skip, honestly. Next we have Mega Man Zero. It was the game that brought Zero back and redesigned him in a way I absolutely hate. I do not like that new design of Zero's at all, but it's cool that he finally got his own game because, I mean, when they made Mega Man X, originally it was going to star Zero by design, and that got nixed, so they kind of held on to Zero. The problem with Mega Man Zero, though, and Mega Man X in general, was that Mega Man X was supposed to end after 4. And the ending of Mega Man 4, or X4, leads into the opening of Mega Man Zero. However, Capcom knew that Mega Man X was selling really, really well, so they wanted to keep that going. And if you play any of the Zero stories after Mega Man X4, they keep retconning basically the exact same ending into the game so that it can connect to Zero. Except that the series kept going, so it kept regressing because, again, the series was supposed to be dead at that point, but they just decided to keep it going. It's a weird story mishmash that doesn't make a lot of sense. But Mega Man Zero, it's a bit jank, but it's pretty good. Next, we have Battle Network 3 White. Battle Network 3 White is a weird thing because, and I don't have any of the other Battle Networks after 3. I used to, they got stolen and they weren't good, so that's fine. But Battle Network 3 is a particularly weird game because, as I say, it's white. They made 2 versions, in fact. I'll save us some time. Pull out blue. These were released in North America, not dissimilarly than the Pokemon games. You know, you could buy white or you could buy blue, but that's not how they were made. Originally in Japan, if you wanted Mega Man Battle Network 3 white and their version of blue black, you actually only could buy white, because this was originally going to be Mega Man 3, Mega Man Battle Network 3. However, several months later, they made a remixed enhanced version that was just supposed to be a straight up update and upgrade, and that was 3 blue, or in their version black. Why they changed it to blue, I don't really know. But it's kind of weird that in the West they sold them as alternate side grade versions, when in Japan it was the difference between buying like Pokemon Red or Pokemon Blue. You know, one of those was a straight up update and significantly better, which is Battle Network 3 Blue, whereas the other was the original version that had less stuff. Now in this game, it's not exactly that one had less stuff than the other. They kind of designed it so it looked like side grades, but this one was just flat out better. It had extra bosses, it had extra stuff, and it was just a better, more fluid experience that had a little bit more bug fixes. But yeah, if you're going to get Battle Network 3, get Blue. Also, if you're going to get Battle Network, watch my reviews of them, because I'm streaming them right now, and watch my streams, because they're really damn good, and I'm going to be at Battle Network 3 real soon. I love the Battle Network games, they are so good. Next we got Battle Network 2. Battle Network 2 was an upgrade to Battle Network 1 in every way. I'm streaming this right now, go watch it. But if you're not familiar with Battle Network, well, it was a weird combination of action RPG and card building deck game that really worked. I think Battle Network was the part of Mega Man that resonated the most with me. And Battle Network 2 made what was the original, which felt like basically a proof of concept, into the game that it should have been in the first place. It added a bunch of custom abilities that made the game kind of react to you, the player. And Battle Network 3 actually went in and made this even more. Basically, the game would actively analyze your play style and give Mega Man a form that would benefit and complement the style you played. Basically, the game modified itself to better suit how you were enjoying it. And that's why I like 3 and 2 over the the fourth game and onwards, because they did the opposite. They gave you forms that required you to play a specific way and meet the game on its terms, as opposed to the game meeting you on your terms. And it felt like a complete regression of the concept of customization in those games. So, get the Battle Network collection, I guess, but play up to 3 and then maybe stop. This is Mega Man Battle Network 4.5. This is a game that is not on the collection, and that's fine. This is a Japanese exclusive game. There was a bunch of interstitial games in Japan. There was games on mobile devices. There was, I think, 2 or 3 Wonder Swan games as well. There was a DS crossover game that, again, never got released in North America. But I love Battle Network, so I wanted to try and collect as many of them as I could, and I was interested about this. If you're familiar with Battle Chip Challenge, it's kind of like that. And if you're not familiar with Battle Chip Challenge basically takes out the adventure and kind of makes it just a combat simulator for the Battle Network games, except that I'm pretty sure your characters were AI controlled the entire time. Like, I remember Battle Chip Challenge basically being a movie you just mashed A through. And 4.5 isn't much different, except you've got more characters to play as and a wider variety of stuff. But it's not a remarkable game by any means of measure. Following that up, we have the original Mega Man Battle Network. Again, you should go watch my reviews and check out my streams on this stuff, but I remember when, I believe it was IGN, first released the trailer in Japanese to this game. I watched it without knowing what was being said on that trailer 13 times. And then every day for like a year after that, I watched that trailer another 13 times. I was so excited about this game because I love Mega Man. It's one of my favorite series of all time. I grew up with it. It was, again, my first rental back in the day and the thing I rented more than anything else. But this was Mega Man as an RPG. They were literally making Mega Man specifically for me at this point, and that blew me away. And this game is nonsensical. Its translation is abhorrent. And it's got so many issues, and it feels like, at best, a proof of concept. But I love it. And I think everyone should get a chance to play them. Or at least the first 3 when they were good. Following that up, we have Telefang 2, Power version. Unlike the original Telefang, I don't think this actually got a translation. I haven't played a lot of it, But this is the sequel to Telefang, or one of the two versions of this sequel to Telefang, and that's really all you need to know. Following that up, we have Medarot Navi. Medarot Navi is a weird game, because the Medarot series at this point was very, very well established, but they decided to do something different with this one. This was a game that was released alongside Medarot 3, or 3.5, the really advanced one that I talked about on the Game Boy Color. But when they made the transition to Game Boy Advance, they decided to change things up, actually kind of like how Battle Network 5 did, where they took a established RPG that was very well beloved and decided to cram a bunch of strategy game elements no one asked for that slowed everything down and made it hard and annoying. And that sucks, because otherwise it's a pretty cool game. But I have that because I just like collecting the Medarot games. Following that up, we have Medarot G. If you're familiar with the Metabots fighting games in North America, that is a reskin of this. That's really all I need to say. It's not a great game. It's kind of like a very, very dollar store, as in that was basically the budget they had when they made it, a dollar store version of Smash with the Medarot characters. Next we have Metabots Rokusho. This is a game I imported from Germany, except it's in English, and I think also Spanish and Italian. I mentioned this before, ordering PAL imports is a tricky endeavor, but this version is in English. The only difference between this and a North American version, really, is that the dollars are now in pounds, but otherwise it's the same. It's Metabots 2, except it's been reanimated, and it looks weird because all the various limbs of your Metabots are individually animated. It looks very, very wonky. But it is an English Metabots game, and it's the only English Metabots game we had that was actually a Metabots style game. Because other than that, we had that weird fighting game, and we had a GameCube game I've shown off that are not really what Metabots was about. This one was. It's also ungodly expensive now, which is why I've got a PAL version. But it's a very, very good game. Next we have Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga. This is kind of like an evolution of the Paper Mario games in the sense that it's an RPG with goofy stories and silly characters and interesting interactions with the world to make advancements in exploration. Except you play as Mario and Luigi at the same time, and that's a really novel idea. I have such fond memories of this game, and I don't think I ever beat it. I rented it 3 or 4 times, and then someone stole it from my rental shop. And I only got this a couple of years ago, and I've played a little bit of it, but it's a lot of fun. I would like to stream this at some point, though. But it's kind of like a reimagining of the Mario RPG formula. It's an RPG, you control 2 characters at the same time, which I never get used to whenever I run into, because it's such a huge gimmick, whenever I run into blocks that require you to swap between the 2 characters, I always get it wrong. But there's timed attacks, timed defenses, and it's just a really silly plot. Princess Peach's speech bubbles have all been turned into explosives, so now she needs to be cured. That's kind of the plot. It's silly, it's goofy, it's a lot of fun. I know there's a bunch of other Mario Luigi games. I haven't played any of them, though. I haven't been able to find them. But I have played this one, and I do like it a lot. Our next game is Lady Sia. This is a game that I was kind of interested in. I didn't know much about it. It is sort of like a Prince of Persia style step platformer on the Game Boy, not unlike, say, Nubo before it. Except you play as this lady with a sword that can also sort of sword fight things. It's not great, but it's not bad. That's about the most complimentary I can be about it. I should talk about it at some point, though, because it is an interesting game. Next we have Super Mario Advance 3, Yoshi's Island, because I love Yoshi's Island. You play as Yoshi, you throw eggs, you try and make sure that little Mario doesn't get eaten by the flying Shy Guys. It's one of the best Super Nintendo games and one of the best platformers in general. I quite like it. Next we have Kururin. I reviewed this forever ago. This is the game where you play as a little bird inside a helicopter that has to fly around environments to try and... Come on, focus. There we go. You have to play a little helicopter that spins around and not crash into walls. It's a puzzle game more than anything, and it's basically a giant accuracy test. And speaking of, you can go check out Jet Wolf's video on Precision Gaming to see footage of games like this. because he recorded a lot of them. In fact, I think he has the entire trilogy, which I'm very jealous about because they are rare. This game is quite a fun little game, and if you can get it cheap, you should, because it is a fun little execution challenge game. And it's totally worth it. It's such a unique game to the system, too. Next we have Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. This is Kirby if you wanted it to be a 4-player multiplayer game. You can't play it single player because the game will generate other Kirbys to help you with puzzles because the game is designed for 4 people. And it's really just sort of annoying to play as one person because it takes place in like a huge open world non-linear style, sort of like Metroid, and a lot of puzzles require 4 Kirbys. It's more annoying than anything. But there's that. Our next game is Iridian 3D. I reviewed this forever ago. It's not a very good game. It's a third-person behind-the-ship shooter shmup that's really more interested in pushing like graphical impressiveness than anything because it's not very playable. Like, your ship takes up such a huge chunk of your view space that it's hard to see stuff you're flying into. There was a sequel made of this. That game is very hard to find. I would love to get a copy at some point because I've heard it's very, very good. And these would lead to the Nano Stray games on the DS, which I've never had a chance to play. Always wanted to play those as well. But the original Iridian, it's dirt cheap. It's also kind of garbage. Following that up, we have the Hobbit video game. I don't know where I got this. I think it might have been that box I got for like 50 bucks from a garage sale a few years back, along with like Mega Man X-Treme. I'm more familiar with the 3D hacky slashy thing that was on consoles. But it's by Sierra, so I'm inclined to think it's probably a thing that hates you and wants you dead if you take 4 steps in the wrong direction. That pile is very fiddly, but we've got 2 more games in this chunk. We have Harvest Moon Friends of Mineral Town, which tells me this one is also Harvest Moon Friends of Mineral Town. Harvest Moon Friends of Mineral Town is one of my favorite games on the Game Boy Advance. I spent thousands of hours in my original copy, but as you can see, they look a little different. That's because this one's a fake. This was one of the games I got for my birthday. And the cruel thing about this is all those fake games were broken in some way or another. This one was broken in the cruelest way you could ever imagine. Because the save data battery on this died. And it died right after I had played for 100 in-game years to get the 100-year marriage anniversary home at the top of the mountain. When that happened, I legitimately did cry. I then walked to a GameStop and bought a new copy and started over. I never got that house again, and I'm sad about that. But you can now get this on the Switch as Story of Seasons Friends of Mineral Town, which has a couple extra characters and some graphical enhancements. But this is one of the Game Boy Advance games I have played more than anything else. This is one of my absolute favorite Game Boy Advance games. I have spent probably thousands upon thousands of hours in this game. Or at least rather this one. I went and bought Harvest Moon, A Wonderful Life on the GameCube, a game I absolutely hate just because connecting it to this unlocked some things, including special background music from Harvest Moon 64, which is a game I love with a passion. I love Friends of Mineral Town more than anything, and I would be happy to tell you this is probably the single best Harvest Moon game of them all. Because I honestly think that. I think I'm a little bit more attached to 64 for nostalgia, because it was my first one. But I think this one's the best. Alright, we got 1 row left, and a few extras. So let's go with Sword of Mana. You know, I said this about Shining Soul, that it's not the best, like, action RPG on the Game Boy Advance. I think I'd give it to Sword of Mana. Because it is really an evolution of Secret of Mana's style, which is funny because it's a remake of the very first game in the Mana series, Final Fantasy Adventure. Which is ironic as well because they would later make a remake of that is entirely regressive of this. But this plays basically like Sword of Mana. This plays a lot like Secret of Mana or Seiken Densetsu 3. It's a nice action RPG. You've got 2 playable characters in a guy that hits things with a sword and a girl who uses magic that are supposedly teammates, but they get separated after about 5 minutes and they never team up again, and then you just go through disposable teammates for the rest of the game. There's weird decisions about this game, and I think a lot of them are just because it is a holdover from Final Fantasy Adventure, but I like Sword of Men. I think it's probably the best action RPG I've played for the system. Next we have Gunstar Superheroes. I actually have 2 copies of this. This is one of the few treasure games that is a sequel to another game, because they've only ever made 3 sequels. Gunstar Heroes got a sequel, Guardian Heroes got a sequel, and of course Ikaruga is a sequel to Radiant Silvergun. This is kind of a weird sequel because it's a sequel, but it's also not. It supposedly follows the events that happen after Gunstar Heroes, but it's entirely a one-to-one retread of the previous events. The only difference is they add a few more mini-games in between rooms, but the rooms are pretty much identical to the original Gunstar Heroes, and one character's a girl, one's a boy, and that's kind of it. As a sequel, it's entirely boring. As a remake, it's fine. But it's Gunstar Heroes, and Gunstar Heroes is good. Our next game is Harry Potter. I don't know how I got this. I've got like a million Harry Potter games. I think I've already said it, but I've never played it. I don't have an interest in it. Next we have other Gunstar Heroes. I have a box for this right next to me. I'll show off later. But again, it's more Gunstar Heroes. Next we have Golden Sun: The Lost Age. This and the previous game are like the most necessary RPGs you can find on the Game Boy Advance. Like, just flat out, if you're collecting for the Game Boy Advance, get the Golden Sun games because they are unbelievably good RPGs. The original is very special to me, and when we dig that out, I will talk about that. But this follows the events after the first game because it's basically one giant game cut in half, but you follow what were ostensibly the villains from the first game. And it's not until like halfway, or maybe even 80% of the way through the game, that we really run into the original team and explain why we're the good guys and they were the bad guys. It's kind of weird that the game kind of just trusts you to understand that you're doing things for the greater good, even if you yourself don't really understand it. The original Golden Sun was one of my earliest reviews, and I have been meaning forever to talk about this game because I do love this series so much. It's been on my short list, but it's a huge game and I have to sink a lot more time into it. I believe it was my junior high senior year, the summer of it, I went and kind of started speedrunning both Golden Sun and Golden Sun 2 before speedrunning was even really a thing, back when it was just Quake done quick. But I was just running through Golden Sun and Golden Sun 2 over and over and over and over again so fast I could go through both in about a week's time of just playing, and I love these games so much. I've spent so much time. They are legendary collectible games for the Game Boy Advance. Get them if you can. Next we have the original Golden Sun. Now I've got a bit of a story with this. I believe it was my 10th birthday I got this, and it was kind of a big deal because my mom was taking me to the Superstore, which is a place she hates, and to be fair, yeah. But the Superstore is ostensibly a grocery market that's also just a giant, like, retail warehouse where you can buy toys and clothes and stuff. And for my birthday, she made me, like, buy a bunch of clothes for myself, and then she said, okay, now you get to pick your birthday present this year, and you get 2 things. One can be a toy, but one can also be a game. And I remember hearing about this, like, I think it just came out. This was before the time where, you know, marketing for game releases was really a thing. It's just games just sort of appeared on shelves every once in a while. But I remember just before I left, I had heard about this game and it sounded so cool. I remember Nintendo created a website with this where the main character actually was voiced for the first time ever, and he introduced the story. And I wish I could find the audio clip of that, because that is just seared into my head. If anyone can find that for me, please do. But this was a birthday present I selected for myself, and I spent my entire 10th birthday just sitting around playing this when we got home. The toy I picked for myself was the Bionicle board game, which I think I played a total of 0 times because no one in my family wanted to play it with me, and to be fair, it probably wasn't very good. But I still have it in my closet. But Golden Sun got a lot of play. And this was a very special birthday present to me. And when I got home, I noticed something suspicious. Something that looked weirdly familiar. There were weird, like, emotion bubbles above characters' heads. And, like, the confirm and deny screens from shops, they looked weirdly familiar. And that's because this was a game made by Camelot, the people who made Shining Force, which was the first game that I ever played that introduced me to anime. This was such a huge game to me, and it had so many cool features like the Djinn, which were like these little elemental spirits you could collect to create summons, and the legendary weapons where they did like super critical hits with like special animations and stuff. There are so many cool things about Golden Sun. This game is amazing, and I love it. to pieces. It is absolutely one of my favorite Game Boy Advance games. Maybe one of my favorite games, just flat out. Our next game is Gauntlet and Rampart. I have never played this, and I don't know where it came from, but I have it. They're old arcade games I don't really have much interest in. Next we have Fire Emblem, The Sacred Stones. This is a game that I think gets dumped on a lot, because a lot of people consider this the easiest Fire Emblem ever. And to be fair, it absolutely is. But the things that make it easy, I think, are typically quality of life things. Let's get that fuzz out of there. This was a game where you could actually like grind your characters up to like their ultimate levels if you wanted. Enemies were significantly easier to kill in this game, although there was still permadeath. There wasn't a way to shut that off. But what made this game so cool compared to the previous Fire Emblem, and one of the most impactful things that I still say is better than most Fire Emblem games today, because I've kind of ignored this feature, was that your characters had split path class evolutions, and that there were training classes that came before even basic classes, so you could train characters up to be like 8 different ways of potential what their end class was, because they had like huge trees to them. It was amazing, and I loved it. Plus, my favorite character of all time, Joshua's in here, because he looks kind of like me, and he's a Myrmidon, and that's my favorite class. So I gotta love this game. But Sacred Stones, I still say, is probably my favorite Fire Emblem. Yeah, it gets dunked on for being too easy, but I love it. Our next game, the original Fire Emblem, or at least the original North American Fire Emblem, because this was actually the 6th or 7th. When this came out, everyone was asking, where's Marth and Roy? I want to play as Marth and Roy. Well, you can play as Roy's dad. No, we want to play as Marth, then Roy, in that order, or we don't care. That's all anyone asked about this game. They didn't give it really much of a chance. The sad thing is this game features my favorite lord of all time, Lyn. She's awful, but I love her. She is the worst lord out of every lord in every game, but I love her. But this game, and the fan response to it, thanks to Smash, is why Marth and Roy are still in like every, well, Marth anyways, in every single Smash Brother, or every single Fire Emblem. That's why Lucina had to cosplay as him, even though she gets completely like pointed out that she's not him immediately. I still hate that. I really hate the impact Marth and Roy have had on the Smash community, bringing them over here, because it feels like the development of Fire Emblem in general has been there just to pander to them, and that really bugs me, because those characters were fine. They had their story. Now let's get some new ones. And now we have Lords as equipment, and I can't stand it. Good game, though. Alright, our next game is this game. I'll just grab 2 of these. This is another game that I got for my birthday that I bought myself that was fake. This is Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. You remember how I said during Tetris I bought like 20 copies of the game before I got one that worked? Kind of the same here. And the one that did break, or the one that did work, was a pirate copy that broke immediately. So I went and bought this one. This was number 21. It finally worked. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is like the one exception to the rule when I say Final Fantasy VI was the last good one. This is an amazing game, but it isn't actually Final Fantasy, it's Tactics Ogre. It's a isometric tactical RPG I have spent hundreds of hours in. You go and wander around a map taking different quests. You go and fight things. There are areas that will permanently kill your characters, which the first time I played, I actually killed the game's mascot, and I felt so bad that I restarted. It's got a cool isekai plot, but what really impressed me about this game utilized sort of the Final Fantasy V system of letting you combine classes, and each character class and every race having special classes, making them infinitely customizable. This game was amazing. Unfortunately, a lot of people seem to really dislike this game because of one of the features I liked, which is the judge system. Basically, before each fight, a judge would show up on the battlefield and create some rules, like saying, okay, swords are out, magic is in. And if you used swords during that fight, you'd get a red card and taken to jail. And if you used magic, you'd get special points that would let you use summons and stuff. I guess people hated that. I loved it, though, because it meant that it kept you on your toes. No fight was something that you were guaranteed to go into with a perfect build, because they could throw out a rule that would completely mess with you. I love this game. It had a pretty solid sequel, too, from what I remember, but this game is easily one of the best Game Boy Advance games. And one of the best Final Fantasy games, easily the best one that's come out since 6, and the only one worth talking about. Alright, next we have Final Fantasy VI. So I have a bit of a story about this. This is, 6 and 5 are probably my favorite Final Fantasy of all time, but this was kind of weird for me. See, I had actually originally played some of the Final Fantasies on the Famicom. I genuinely don't understand, I don't remember under what circumstances, but I remember that Final Fantasy was named weird stuff because, of course, we didn't get 2, we didn't get 3. Fourth game was our second game. So I was going to a GameStop to buy a game for my cousin for her birthday, which I got her Knight's Journey of Dreams. Awesome game that I use a lot of soundtrack from. And I remember seeing this on the shelf. And I remember hating Final Fantasy III. Because Final Fantasy III, which was the Japanese one, I just really disliked. And I remember at one point, my mom had taken me to one of her clients' houses, and they had a Super Nintendo. They let me play one of their games, and they had a Final Fantasy III as well, and I loved that game. I remember there being this really sort of harrowing shot at the start of a bunch of mechs walking in the snow towards this really doomed-looking village, and that stuck with me. And then I lost on the tutorial boss because I didn't realize that you could just sit around and wait for him to become, vulnerable. I walked home with my cousin's present, and I was still thinking about this because I couldn't remember if this was Final Fantasy III, as in the game I hated, or Final Fantasy III, the best one I ever played. And bear in mind, it was about a 2-hour walk from the mall to my house. I then proceeded to walk another 2 hours back to the mall to pick this up when I realized this was the game I loved. So I had spent about 8 hours going to and from that mall to get that present for my cousin, just to get this. And, man, it's worth it. I love Final Fantasy VI so much. It's my favorite one. And, at least for a while, this was the best version. I think there's a version on Steam now that's supposedly better. I'm not sure, but, I love Final Fantasy VI. Next we have Final Fantasy IV. It's okay. I wish I had Final Fantasy V Advanced because Final Fantasy V is my next favorite one. Final Fantasy IV is okay. I honestly even forgot I even had this, because I don't know where I got this. This just sort of coalesced in my collection at some point, because I know I have the Super Famicom version, and that's the version I always play. But this is the one with Cecil Harvey and the kids that get introduced just to die instantly, and a bunch of other characters that get sacrificed like pawns, except none of them do because the story's not super well written. I know people are really fond of Final Fantasy IV, and it's got things I like about it, things I dislike about it, but honestly, I just wish I had Final Fantasy V Advance. I need to complete the set now. Alright, next we have Drill Dozer. This is an interesting game. This was put out by Game Freak, from what I remember, and how I got this was kind of weird because after I started the show, I kind of became known as like my local GameStop's best customer because every weekend I'd be there and I'd pick up used games and stuff. And at one point they told me that they got a bunch of Game Boy Advance games and they were keeping them behind the counter. And for one moment, they let me go behind the counter where I wasn't allowed to just pull out all the Game Boy Advance games before anyone else, and I grabbed this one. You might notice that the cartridge is a bit weirdly shaped as compared to, say, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, even though this is the pirate version. That's because this has a rumble pack in it. You play as this little girl in this little tank with a drill. You have to upgrade your drill to go through levels, and it shakes a whole bunch. This is actually a really, really cool game. So I'm glad I've got it. It's a remarkable game, and one worth talking about. I just haven't played it in forever. So next we have Dogs. For some reason, this is one of my more popular videos when I made a gameplay video of this, so I'm honestly thinking about reviewing this just because people seem to enjoy this. I have no frame of reference for this game. I made a gameplay video of it, and that's the only time I've ever played it. I've never really interacted with Dogs. I know it started life as a browser-based thing on Flash, but that's kind of it. But like I said, people seem to really dig this. Maybe I'll make a review sometime soon. Virtual pets. I'm kind of getting more and more into them. Alright, next we have Densetsu no Staffy 3. This is the Legend of Starfy 3. This is a really cool platformer, and I'll just pull out the other two because they're going to be the next ones. I've reviewed one of them. I've been meaning to get to the others as well. But Starfy 2, Starfy 1, Starfy 3. Unfortunately, we never got one of the DS games, and we never got these three, but we did get the, I think, 5th or 6th one. These are very basic platformers where you play as a little starfish that swims around and spins. You probably know him from Smash. They are really solid. I've got gameplay videos and a review of one of them, and you should play them if you can get them. I think they're getting harder to find to import, but they are definitely must-have imports. Okay, let's get these three out of the way. Oh, or maybe two. These are weird games. There's, I believe, 4 games in this series. These games are known as Dangerous Grandpa. You'll never guess why I bought them, but it might rhyme with I wanted games that were called Dangerous Grandpa, and I needed to know what they were. These are weird comedic games that are completely different from one another. Like I said, I think there's 4 of them. One of them is like a weird top-down game. One of them's like a weird minigame compilation, if I remember correctly. And one of them, I think it's this one, was kind of like the Klonoa Game Boy Advance games. It was like a side-scrolling platformer that was like in a really like condensed area. Like you were trapped in very, very thin walls and sort of like a maze-like area. It was a side-scrolling platformer. They're weird games. I think you really need to know Japanese to play them, but they're weird and they had a weird name, so I needed them, is the short version of this. Next we have Custom Robo GX, because I had to have Custom Robo. This is a weird game, because Custom Robo is usually a sort of isometric third-person shooter, and this one's a side-scrolling shooter. It's a very, very weird take on Custom Robo. I don't really like it. It doesn't gel very well. It seems more experimental than anything. But it's weird, and it's interesting, and with this it means I'm only missing the DS game and I've got the full set. And I do like Custom Robo. Alright, next we have Crash Nitro Kart. This was kind of a sequel to Crash Team Racing, but on the Game Boy Advance. I believe my uncle got me this in that bundle of other Game Boy Advance games he got. But I also have the console ports, so I haven't really spent any time with this. Alright, next we have Car Battler Go. This is a game that in English is known as Car Battler Joe. I reviewed this forever ago. It's an amazing game. It is sort of an RPG, sort of a third-person open-world racing game in a post-apocalyptic world. It is very, very weird. It's also a prequel to a weird Sega Saturn third-person vehicle combat game, which this also kind of is one. It's a very, very strange game, and it was released in English as a Japanese copy, mainly because it's hard to find in English. But try and find Car Battler Joe. I reviewed it forever ago. Go watch my review. But damn, this is a game worth keeping on your radar. For sure. Alright, our next game is Breath of Fire 2, and I'm betting, as I fling it under the camera, the other one is Breath of Fire. Now, like I said, my uncle got a bunch of Game Boy games. He was kind of worried because he spent $20 on Game Boy games. And again, I would have just said, you know, buy them all, because... But the last games he listed was, when he told me all these games he got, it was like Sonic Advance, Tom and Jerry, all these games he thought were okay. And he's like, yeah, and I was a little iffy on these games. They're called Breath of Fire, and I almost dropped my phone because I'm like, are you serious? These were basically launch titles, and they're not the best ports, but they are hard to find. And they are based on Super Nintendo RPGs I have always wanted to play. The fact that he just offhandedly mentioned that he grabbed these, I was like, no way. You're joking. No way. For $1 each? Holy crap. So yeah, Breath of Fire. These were Capcom-based RPGs. These were some of the earliest Super Nintendo ports on the Game Boy Advance, and they're not the best. In fact, there are like ROM hacks of these that try and restore their audio and their visual stuff. But I had never played Breath of Fire, so to have these, that was a big deal to me. I'm still trying to get the third one because I've heard that's the best one, and it's the one I saw in a magazine when I was a kid and always wanted to play. But to have these was a big deal to me. And to have my uncle just offhandedly mention that, like they were like the least important thing, it's like, really? That's amazing. Okay, so next we have Bomberman Tournament. This is kind of a sequel to Bomberman Quest on the Game Boy Color, as well as kind of a sequel to a game on the PC Engine and TurboGrafx 16 called Newtopia, because this was physically designed to be a sequel to that. It's a top-down sort of Zelda-y adventure game, but you play as Bomberman trying to rescue Max. It's a very, very good game. I tried to do a Bomber Week on this at one point, But again, I use emulation consoles to record just because it looks and sounds better, and they struggled with this game. But I have played through this, and I can tell you it is very, very good Bomberman on the GBA. Next we have Bomberman Max 2 Red. This is a sequel to Bomberman Max, except this is the Max version. And this version looks very, well, this game looks very jank because it uses pre-rendered sprites and stuff, and it just doesn't look quite right, you know? But it is a sequel to Bomberman Max, and Bomberman Max was always quite a cool game. When you cleared a level, it would like spawn 3 teleporters to completely different areas, so you had to go through different areas several times to play every area and collect stuff, similar to that. If you want to see everything, you will spend a lot of time playing these games, and that's great. And it helps me to finish my Bomberman handheld collection. Next we have Blender Brothers. This was a game Nico kind of inadvertently sent me. He bought me a copy of Hybrid Heaven on the N64, but because I'm in Canada, he sent me the US dollar amount and kind of made a mistake on that. And I asked him, hey, do you want that money back? And he's like, no, just, you know, reinvest it in something. So I got Epic Mickey on the Wii, and I saw this on Amazon. This is a game I had been looking on at Amazon for a while because there was a copy for super, super cheap. This is a very rare and expensive game. And it was on Amazon for about $5. And it had been on there for about over a year. And I was like, okay, this is my reason to get this. This game is a 2D platformer that has some like sort of Mode 70 mini games that you have to clear. It looks very, very cool and it's kind of neat, but it's very, very janky and not very fun to play, unfortunately. It's rare, it's expensive, it's not worth it, but I didn't spend much, and once again, thank you, Nico, for inadvertently hooking me up for a copy, because I had been looking into this for a very long time. Alright, next we have Bomberman Jetters, not to be confused with the collection I showed much earlier. This is Bomberman Tournament, except it follows a prequel to the Bomberman Jetters anime that at this point you better have watched, like I told you to. This follows Shirobon's older brother Mighty going on an adventure to save the day. I've shown off gameplay of this, I've played a little bit of this. It's a lot of fun. It's a little bit hard to play because it's entirely in Japanese, but it is very, very fun. If you like Zelda, if you like Newtopia, if you like Bomberman Tournament, if you like Bomberman, if you like Bomberman Quest, play this. It's hard to find import, but it's worth it. Next we have probably some of the most interesting Game Boy games. We have Boktai, The Sun is in Your Hand, and Boktai, Solar Boy Django. 2 games that are probably best known for their cameos in Mega Man Battle Network. These were games put out by Hideo Kojima, and they feature quite a cool little thing. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah. See that right there? That little black square? That's a solar cell. These games were kind of solar powered. If UV light hit those, they would power up your weapons in-game because you were a vampire hunter and you fought using a gun made of the sun, the Gun del Sol. Now, I really want to talk about Boktai 2 because Boktai 1 was one of my earliest reviews, and I'm quite proud of that, and I want to talk more about these because I love these games. They're obscure and they're awesome. But Boktai 1 was really, really cool. You had one weapon that could solve every problem because it was designed entirely modularly, and every dungeon would give you like a new toy to attach to your weapon to see how it changed and worked with. This game, the first thing they did was take your gun away and give you weapons that didn't work with the sun. And they took away the modularness of the weapons. And I know a couple of people who really love Boktai 2 but don't get Boktai 1. I'm the opposite. This game took away everything I loved about Boktai 1, but I still love Boktai, and I still don't have a copy of 3. I need to get a translated copy of 3 at some point, but I have the rest of the series. These games are unbelievably rare and expensive nowadays, but these are such a weird and interesting game. It's a solar-powered GBA game. Unfortunately, you could not defeat the bosses without the sun either, so people who are stuck in the basement or, you know, places where it doesn't get sun because it's, you know, nighttime all the time, because there are places on Earth like that, you couldn't defeat the bosses and you were soft-locked, and that's not good. But I really like the gimmick, and it made for a very special series that I love with a passion. Still need to get the 3rd game, though, but I love Boktai. Next we got Harry Potter Quidditch Thing. I never played it. Don't know how I got it. Don't really care. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4. I have played basically every Tony Hawk game, and I hate every Tony Hawk game except for one. I don't know how I got this. I don't care, if I'm being honest. Next we have Super Puzzle Fighter 2. This is a puzzle game based on Street Fighter 2, if that wasn't clear. This is a fantastic puzzle game. It's not as cool as, what was it, Zoo Cube, which I don't actually have, or Zoo, I can't remember what it was called, but that's a really good puzzle game for the GBA as well. This was one of those games that came with Breath of Fire that my uncle got for $1, and while I'm awful at puzzle games, I have sunk a lot of time into this game. I love Super Puzzle Fighter 2. It's a very, very cool game. Next we have Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Revival, because I'm bad at Street Fighter. I heard the new one actually has some like accessibility options for controls. Gonna have to try it, but this game, it's pretty good for what it is, but I don't like it because I can't play it. And we're getting really close to the bottom. I think we only have 3 more. We have Sonic Pinball Party. Along with Super Robot Pinball, this is the next best pinball game I've ever played. It has a Nights into Dream pinball table, as well as a Sonic pinball table. But, like the other games, this was one I bought for my birthday that was pirated and it had no save data. And while it had KO Garden connectivity for Sonic Adventure and Adventure 2, which I loved with a passion, it wouldn't remember them, and I actually lost several of my characters that way. And that sucks, because I'd love to get an official version of this, because this is one of my favorite pinball games of all time. But I'm also just a huge fan of Nights into Dreams. Alright, our next game is without a faceplate, but this is Super Mario World. I think my brother used to own this, and he gave it to me. But I like Super Mario World. It's like one of my favorite Mario games, so having this was very, very cool. And for the last one we have in this box, we have Super Mario Bros. 3, which means I'm only missing the original Super Mario Advance game. And they weren't the best ports. This one's actually kind of neat because it has a lot of extra features if you have the e-reader cards. Unfortunately, I don't. And I haven't found a hacked version of this that includes that stuff, although I'm sure there are versions of that out there. I just have to look, but I haven't had time. But this is Super Mario Bros. 3. I think a lot of people like it. They think it's the best NES game ever. I don't agree, but, you know, to each their own. And that box is empty, and my battery's about to die, but we're not quite done yet, because I do have a couple of physical games, so I'll charge my battery real quick and we'll be back. The last set of games we have, or rather, sort of game accessories, are boxed games, but they're mostly games I just haven't put on their boxes, because I had them separated, because they were in different spots. Starting off, Harvest Moon Friends of Mineral Town. Like I said, I went and bought this at a GameStop, literally the moment that my copy died. And I still have it in box. I guess I'm going to go throw my actual copy in this now, but, yep, good I have that. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. I've gone through so many copies, it's surprising I only have one box, let's be honest. Got Golden Sun, The Lost Age. I found this in my closet. I'm surprised I still had this because they're cardboard boxes. They kind of disappear on you. But, yeah, got The Lost Age. We have Gunstar Superheroes, which I did pay 98 cents for. So, that's a good feeling. I've got 2 copies. I think one has a bit of a save battery issue, but I've got 2 copies now. Maybe I'll trade one away or something. Next we have Battle Network 3 Blue version, i.e. the good version, the version I had when I was a kid. Got the ninja style and everything in it. This is pretty cool to have. Next, in the similar vein, I got this when I went behind the scenes at GameStop. I have a sealed copy of Battle Network 6 Falzer. This is actually still in shrink. It has the secondary manual that's in French, because for some reason, when they released this in Canada, they had to like tack on a secondary manual in the back. I had an original copy that was stolen, as well as my Battle Networks 4 and 5, but those games are bad. Battle Network 6 is okay, I guess. The thing is, it maintains that Battle Network once again took away the customization of Battle Network 3 and 2 and instead favored the whole change your play style to match how we want you to play, instead of we'll change how the game plays to match your style. And that's always been an issue with me. Also, apparently Falzer's like the non-canonical bad version, the other version's significantly better. And since I'm streaming all these, maybe I'll finally play that version. But this version, especially sealed, is worth a lot of money. So that's actually a fairly chunky, expensive bit of my collection. I also got this from GameStop behind the scenes. We have Zoid's Legacy, which I owned a cartridge of at one point, but then again, it got stolen. But this is kind of an okay Zoid's RPG. It got several sequels on the DS, of which we got none of them. I like to liken the 3 Zoid games we got as one being really, really good in Zoid's Battle Legend, one being okay, this one, and one being awful, being the Xbox one. That's the only one I don't have. But this is just sort of an average RPG. It's okay, it's not great. Maybe I'll talk about it at some points. But it's sealed, so that's cool. And the last box game I have, going back to my massive passion of this import series, we have Shin Gata Medarat Kuwagata. This is a weird-ass game. This is ostensibly a remake to the original Medarat game, except that's supposed to be Head Scissors or Rokusho. This is... They had a completely different animation style and like visual style for their characters, and they look like garbage. And to add salt to the wounds, Shin in Shin Gata means true. What this is saying is this is Medarat Kuwagata, the true type. This is the real one. You know that old Medarat Kuwagata you played? That's bullshit. This is the real one. This ugly, mangled mess is real Medarat Kuwagata. This is actually, along with Medarat 5, the rarest Medarat game you can get, and I have it sealed, and I paid like $10 for it, because the seller just didn't want it. Yeah, that's all my boxed games on the system. But there's one more thing I'd like to do before we end this video, so I'll be back in a sec. See, this is my entire Game Boy collection, all spread out. You know, I thought it would be a good educational chance to see what this all would look like in one go, as opposed to having it as a single box. This is my entire Game Boy collection, all at once. And I hope you enjoyed this video. And, you know, if you did, you know, like it, subscribe, all that good nonsense. Tell me what your favorite game in my collection is. You know, suggest some games that I want to play, because I have hardly scratched the surface of these 3 legacy consoles of awesome things that I love with a passion. And I certainly know on my wish list there's probably at least a good couple hundred more games on here I'd like to collect. But, you know, let me know what you like. Let me know what I should keep an eye out for. And, you know, if you've got games you don't want anymore, feel free to send them my way. You know, all that good stuff. You might also want to check out and subscribe to my YouTube channel, see everything else I do, which is a lot of stuff. I've got some reviews on the way. Check out and subscribe to my Twitch to see everything else I do there, because, heck, I'm streaming a lot of Battle Network right now. As I point over there, even though I point there, you can tell I'm not using a tripod and having to one-hand this. And yeah, you know, if you like this stuff, check out the Patreon, support the show there so that I can afford more awesome Game Boy games for very little money. And, you know, at the end of the day, I guess we're left with one question, and that is, where the heck is Dangerous Grandpa in all this? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Peace out, Internet.